The European Space Agency has finally done what millions have been waiting for, released the first official photographs of 3I Atlas as it approached Mars. At first glance, they look ordinary. A faint object trailing a thin mist of dust and gas, nothing more than a comet reflecting the dim light of the sun. But the moment those images went public, something about them didn't sit right with the people who study such things. And within hours, private astronomers began to notice what ESA itself had not commented on at all. Two strange inconsistencies that quietly changed everything. What's odd is that this time, ESA didn't seem eager to celebrate. Normally, a release like this would be accompanied by press briefings, simulations, color-corrected composites, the kind of full public showcase that excites both scientists and the media. But instead, the photos arrived without fanfare. A few still frames tucked quietly into the agency's data archive late at night, with little explanation. The announcement was so understated that most of the public didn't even notice. Those who did, however, noticed immediately that something was missing. The metadata from the first set of images didn't match the timestamps of ESA's observation schedule. The light exposure was slightly off, as if two different cameras, or two different passes, had been stitched together, and that was problem number one. The second, even stranger, the trajectory markers embedded in the data didn't align with NASA's previous coordinates. According to ESA's own capture, 3I Atlas wasn't quite where it should have been. It was slightly behind, not by much, just a few thousand kilometers. But in the vast mathematics of space, that's enough to raise questions that no one can yet answer. Before we go further, take a moment to breathe and settle in. These late-night journeys through space are meant for reflection, not fear. So if you're watching from your living room in Canada, or maybe listening somewhere in London or Melbourne before bed, your presence here helps this small corner of the internet stay alive. Tap that like button, share where you're watching from, and let's continue unraveling this mystery together. For scientists, this discrepancy between agencies is deeply uncomfortable. ESA and NASA track the same data streams, share telemetry, and often cross-check each other's measurements. They should be in perfect sync. But this time, something diverged, just slightly enough to matter. Some analysts suggested it was nothing more than a calibration delay. Others weren't so sure. You see, 3I Atlas has been unusual from the beginning. Since its discovery, its orbit hasn't behaved like a typical interstellar object. Its acceleration patterns are uneven, its reflected light oscillates rhythmically, and fragments appear to detach and then reattach, something that should be physically impossible. For months, the world's observatories have tried to model its movement, but every new data release seems to rewrite the last. And now, ESA's new photos have added yet another layer of complexity. Under infrared analysis, faint distortions appear near the object's coma, areas of interference that suggest either magnetic turbulence or a composition we've never seen before. The colors in the images were consistent with carbon-rich dust, but the surrounding glow. That's where things turned strange. The spectrum hinted at emissions not typical of comets or asteroids, a mix of ionized elements behaving like a plasma field but fluctuating in rhythm, almost as though pulsing to a hidden pattern. It would be easy to dismiss this as image noise or data corruption, but astronomers quickly pointed out that the same pattern repeats across several independent captures taken hours apart from separate telescopes across different continents. It's not a sensor issue, it's real. That's where the conversation takes a darker turn, because if these distortions aren't artifacts of technology, then they must belong to 3I Atlas itself. And if that's true, it means we're observing a kind of behavior that defies our current understanding of interstellar objects. No comet should emit structured light patterns. No natural body should maintain oscillations that appear timed. ESA, for their part, has remained silent. No interviews, no clarifications. Just quiet data releases and quiet redactions. A few amateur astronomers reported that earlier versions of the images were briefly available in higher resolution, but within hours they vanished from the official servers. What replaced them were cropped, lower-quality versions with cleaned-up exposure levels. At first, this seemed like normal housekeeping. Agencies routinely reprocess images to correct noise or adjust scaling. But as the astrophotography community compared screenshots and cached archives, differences began to emerge. Small, almost imperceptible details, faint smudges, thin streaks, subtle color shifts had been removed. Why would ESA modify its own raw data? There are innocent explanations, of course. calibration errors, compression adjustments, realignment of visual fields. But there's also the unsettling possibility that the agency saw something it wasn't ready to explain. It wouldn't be the first time. Years ago, when the Rosetta mission photographed Comet 67P, unusual emissions were briefly reported, structures resembling geometric light bursts, and were quickly attributed to camera artifacts. A familiar pattern of explanation, acknowledge, then obscure. Scientists are cautious by nature, and for good reason. The last thing they want is to ignite sensational speculation, but this time, something feels different. The level of caution seems out of proportion to the apparent simplicity of the data. A few altered photos shouldn't demand silence from an entire agency, unless perhaps the anomalies revealed something that challenges existing physics. So, what could those two problems really mean? Were the timestamps and trajectories merely off, or were they deliberately adjusted? Because when independent astronomers recalculated the object's predicted path using ESA's released data, they found something alarming. If the new coordinates are correct, 3I Atlas didn't just slow down, it shifted. A subtle but measurable lateral drift, as if some external force had momentarily altered its motion. That's where tonight's mystery deepens. When a celestial object changes course in deep space, even by the smallest fraction, the question that arises isn't how, but why. Natural forces in the cosmos follow predictable laws: gravity, radiation pressure, sublimation from ice, all measurable, all modelled. But the data emerging from ESA's release didn't align with any of them. The shift in 3I Atlas's path wasn't consistent with cometary outgassing or gravitational influence. It was clean, precise, almost deliberate. Astronomers immediately began to debate the cause. Some suggested it might be a magnetic anomaly, a region of charged particles in the solar wind interacting with the object's tail, creating a small but measurable push. But even that theory felt incomplete. The solar wind doesn't act like a hand guiding a ship. It's chaotic, diffuse, unpredictable. For 3I Atlas to respond so cleanly, something had to be guiding it. Others pointed toward internal processes, cryovolcanic venting, the rapid escape of trapped gases, even localized heating as it passed through subtle variations in sunlight. But again, the numbers didn't add up. The object's luminosity didn't fluctuate in sync with the shift. No outburst, no detectable jet, no plume of material that could account for the momentum change. It was as though something invisible had tugged it slightly off course. And this is where speculation, the kind scientists rarely admit to, quietly began to spread. Not among the public, but within the professional community itself. The possibility that 3I Atlas might not be a fully natural body has always lingered at the edge of the discussion, a shadow that refuses to fade. The shape of its light curve, the rhythm of its emissions, even its rotational period, all hint at something structured, not necessarily artificial, but not entirely random either. When the European Space Agency's updated trajectory maps were compared to NASA's earlier ones, the difference wasn't just positional. The object's spin appeared to have changed too, a small but detectable variation in its angular momentum. If it were shedding material unevenly, this might make sense. But again, no visual evidence supported that. Instead, the object seemed calmer, more stable, even as its direction shifted slightly toward Mars's orbital plane. That subtle adjustment, less than a degree, but still measurable, placed it on a path that intersected not with the planet itself, but with a region trailing behind it, a gravitational shadow where dust, radiation, and plasma interact in complex ways. It's a quiet, unstable zone, usually empty, but for reasons no one yet understands, 3I Atlas was heading directly for it. The question now was, did the object react to something in that zone, or was it aiming for it? As word of this anomaly spread, ESA's silence deepened. Journalists began reaching out to agency scientists for comment, only to receive vague statements about ongoing analysis. Independent researchers tried to replicate the findings, but the most recent high-resolution data was suddenly unavailable. One by one, public data links began redirecting to archived pages, marked for review. This pattern, of information appearing, then quietly disappearing, reignited an older anxiety within the astronomy community. The same pattern had unfolded during the Oumuamua controversy years before. First the discovery, then the odd acceleration, then the unexplainable behavior, followed by official restraint and minimal explanation. It's as though whenever nature presents something that doesn't fit our models, our first instinct isn't curiosity, it's caution. And yet, curiosity always finds a way. Several amateur observatories in South America, Australia, and parts of Eastern Europe managed to capture their own independent imagery. When analysed, those frames showed something the ESA images did not. Just behind 3i Atlas, faint, diffuse, almost spectral, were several points of light moving in sync, not fragments, not debris, but small, consistent bodies maintaining relative position over time. That discovery sent quiet ripples through the global research network. Multiple bodies moving in unison is rare in interstellar visitors. Gravity could keep fragments together for a time, but only under precise conditions. And yet these points, whatever they were, remained perfectly spaced, their distances unchanged over multiple frames. Some astronomers speculated that they were loose ejecta orbiting a common barycenter. Others proposed electromagnetic tethering, like dust caught in an invisible field. But a few, the ones who'd seen similar data in the case of Oumuamua and Borisov, whispered another word: synchronization. If the data was correct, these smaller points of light were not merely following the object. They were maintaining relative orientation, almost like a pattern, a constellation that traveled with purpose. ESA's official imagery did not show these points. They'd been cropped out, or perhaps they were never included. But in the quiet corners of online observatory forums, pixel-level comparisons began surfacing. Overlays revealed faint halos that matched exactly where the independent captures had shown the anomalies. It was clear something had been there. Faint, yes, but undeniably present. The European Space Agency later released a clarification, short, technical, and sterile. It stated that reflections, cosmic ray interference, and parallax effects could produce artifacts resembling companion points in long-exposure frames. But astronomers familiar with ESA's imaging systems quickly noted that these reflections appeared across multiple instruments and multiple nights. Cosmic rays strike at random. They don't replicate structured patterns. The more ESA explained, the less convincing it sounded. As the debate deepened, the emotional tone of the community began to shift. What started as excitement over new data turned into unease, because these patterns, if genuine, implied coordination. They implied awareness. And if not awareness, then a physics we do not yet understand. That realization hung quietly in every conversation. The idea that an interstellar visitor could exhibit intentional behavior is not one most scientists entertain publicly. It crosses the line between observation and interpretation, a place where evidence blurs into imagination. But behind closed doors, among researchers trading encrypted messages and private papers, the possibility is being discussed again. A non-gravitational adjustment, a stable swarm-like formation, selective data suppression. One could argue that it's all coincidence, that light, timing, and chance have once again conspired to trick us. But as one astronomer quietly remarked in a late-night conference call, coincidences are not supposed to repeat this many times in a row. And so, the two problems with ESA's photos have transformed into something larger, a question that stretches beyond astronomy itself. If 3i Atlas isn't behaving like a comet, and its light isn't reflecting like ice or dust, then perhaps, just perhaps, we are not witnessing a passive traveller at all. Maybe what ESA's cameras caught in those few quiet frames was something alive in motion, not biologically, but cosmically, something aware of where it is and aware of what's watching it. By the third night after ESA's quiet release, the conversation had already moved beyond the agency itself. Across small observatories and encrypted forums, data analysts began comparing light curves, exposure stacks, and infrared overlays. The patterns that had once seemed like background noise now formed something more intricate, a lattice of faint distortions, each pulsing with mathematical precision. At first, many dismissed it as coincidence, a trick of stacked imagery perhaps, or the echo of background radiation. But as more independent datasets poured in from Chile, Spain, and South Africa, the consistency of those pulses became impossible to ignore. They weren't random, they were rhythmic. Every 71 minutes, give or take a few seconds, the field surrounding 3i Atlas dimmed, then brightened again. Not the object itself, but the region immediately around it, a faint ripple in the light, repeating with machine-like regularity. It wasn't strong enough to suggest energy emission, but it was there, always there. One of the first to notice was an astrophotographer in the Canary Islands. His observation logs described it as a heartbeat of light. That phrase caught on quickly. By the next morning, the term had spread across astronomy boards and even leaked into small science news blogs, the heartbeat of 3I Atlas. And that's when things began to get complicated, because shortly after those discussions began, several of the original image repositories went dark. Public data links expired without warning. Researchers attempting to access ESA's deep archive were met with timeouts and blank responses. Within hours, the official explanation appeared: a scheduled maintenance window for server optimization. The timing was impeccable. For professionals used to pattern recognition, the sudden blackout wasn't just inconvenient, it was revealing. Whenever space agencies need to withhold something, the process usually looks exactly like this: temporary unavailability, followed by revised versions of the data, then a new explanatory statement that reframes what everyone had already seen. It's a quiet kind of control. But this time, ESA wasn't the only one holding the cards. Independent observatories had already mirrored the files, and several analysts were running continuous sky scans. You can't erase photons once they've reached a telescope. What those independent images revealed next is what started to change the tone of the conversation entirely. When the region around 3I Atlas was processed through polarization filters, faint trails appeared, not straight, but curved. They formed subtle arcs extending behind the object, as if lines of invisible force were sweeping through the dust. And at the intersection of those arcs, the brightness of the heartbeat reached its peak. Physically, this made no sense. Magnetic fields in interstellar space don't form such tight geometries, especially not in isolated comets. The curvature suggested structure. One scientist, speaking anonymously in an internal ESA forum, described it as a pattern that implies orientation. In other words, whatever forces surrounded 3I Atlas seemed to know where the object was heading and adjusted accordingly. Meanwhile, small leaks began to surface. A short internal memo, allegedly from a mid-level data analyst, circulated across private Discord servers before being quietly deleted. The text was brief, clinical, and unnervingly direct. Spectral variance confirmed. Polarized emission at 280 nanometers, consistent with interference pattern, not natural scattering. Recommend suppression until verification. Those 8 words, recommend suppression until verification, ignited an online storm. It wasn't an admission of secrecy, but it wasn't a denial either, and in the absence of clarity, the public filled the silence with imagination. Even mainstream science journalists began asking, what kind of interference could exist around a comet that's supposedly nothing more than ice and dust? Could it be a solar reflection effect, a data overlap, or something we don't yet have the vocabulary to explain? The rhythm of the heartbeat continued, every 71 minutes, unwavering. It was around this time that Mars itself started behaving oddly. Seismic data from the InSight lander, still transmitting occasional readings, began showing faint tremors again, too weak to indicate tectonic movement, too regular to be random. A whisper beneath the Martian crust, occurring almost in tandem with 3I Atlas's pulse. Coincidence, perhaps. But coincidences don't usually keep time with precision. That connection, the comet's rhythm and Mars's vibration, became the second invisible problem, the one no one at ESA wanted to speak about publicly. Because if the pulse wasn't instrumental or environmental, it suggested resonance. Something was responding, and resonance is rarely passive. In the weeks that followed, several astronomers quietly removed their public commentary on the subject. Social media posts vanished, journal preprints were withdrawn, and even casual speculation threads began to empty out. Those who persisted received polite emails from supervisors reminding them of professional discretion. But the amateur community kept going. They always do. A network of sky watchers began stitching together a timeline, plotting every confirmed light fluctuation and cross-referencing it with Mars's recorded quakes. The alignment was uncanny. Not perfect, but close enough to make the hair rise on the back of your neck. Each pulse, they noted, seemed to arrive seconds earlier than expected, as though whatever signal it carried was increasing in frequency, like a heartbeat quickening with excitement, or anticipation. And then came the whispers of something else. Some observers reported a dim secondary glow near Mars's upper atmosphere, a diffuse haze visible only under certain infrared wavelengths. At first, it was thought to be auroral activity, but its position and timing didn't fit the usual pattern. The haze appeared on the planet's night side, precisely when 3I Atlas's pulse peaked in brightness. Could this mean the two phenomena were connected? The possibility alone was enough to divide the community. Scientists who had dismissed the object's heartbeat now found themselves reconsidering. If electromagnetic resonance was at play, perhaps the pulses were more than optical illusions. Perhaps they were physical, radiating outward and interacting with nearby fields. And if so, what could generate that kind of patterned emission? The energy required to produce synchronized ripples across millions of kilometers would be astronomical, far beyond any known cometary process. That kind of regularity implies control, or at least intent. ESA has yet to address that question directly. Their latest statement, released quietly on their website, claims the irregular light patterns were caused by overlapping exposure sequences from different telescopes and that any perceived rhythm was a result of frame rate synchronization. But those who've seen the raw data know better, because no matter how you align, stretch, or normalize those frames, the 71-minute rhythm remains intact. It persists through every correction, every calibration. It doesn't belong to the camera. It belongs to 3I Atlas. The silence surrounding it grows heavier by the day, and if the rhythm is accelerating, as the latest amateur readings suggest, then whatever is causing it isn't slowing down, it's waking up. By now, even the most conservative researchers could sense it. Something about 3I Atlas was no longer fitting within the comfortable limits of theory. The object that once seemed like a routine interstellar comet had become something else entirely, a puzzle that refused to stay solved. Inside ESA, the mood was quietly changing. Internal briefings shifted from cautious optimism to subdued tension. Scientists who had been eager to discuss the discovery were suddenly unavailable for interviews. Those who did speak publicly sounded measured, their language stripped of speculation. Words like anomaly, fluctuation, and artifact replaced anything that hinted at structure or rhythm. But then, as it often happens in moments like this, information began to leak. A short technical report, never meant for public release, surfaced on an encrypted astronomy forum. It was time-stamped 3 days before ESA's official press silence. The document contained fragments of internal correspondence between data teams in Darmstadt and Nordwijk. Most of it was routine, calibration updates, exposure logs, software checks, until the final paragraph. It read simply, "Preliminary analysis suggests periodic modulation consistent with artificial interference. Further confirmation required. Do not disseminate until full cross-correlation complete." Those 9 words, periodic modulation consistent with artificial interference, were enough to ignite a quiet storm. They weren't proof of anything extraordinary, but in the world of scientific language, they were heavy. Artificial interference doesn't mean alien. It could mean anything, from Earth-based radar bleed to software noise, but it also could mean something that wasn't random, something deliberate. The document spread faster than ESA could contain it. Analysts dissected every phrase, every timestamp, every reference code. Within hours, space-focused communities online were ablaze with interpretations. Some dismissed it as a forgery. Others compared it to similar phrases that appeared in the Oumuamua research archives from years earlier. But what made this leak different was timing. It coincided with a second data drop from ESA's deep archive, one that contained low-frequency radio measurements from their Mars-tracking satellites. Buried in those numbers was a pattern that matched the optical pulse from 3I Atlas. 71 minutes. Exactly. If the data were accurate, it meant that the object wasn't just reflecting light, it was emitting energy across multiple spectra, optical, radio, and possibly even magnetic. The signals weren't strong enough to call communication, but their synchronization was unmistakable. Suddenly, the question of intent was back on the table. Inside ESA, sources later described a containment mode, a protocol designed for unverified anomalies that might spark public misinterpretation. It wasn't censorship, it was damage control. They needed time to verify the data, to rule out instrument error or terrestrial contamination. But outside the agency, that silence only amplified suspicion. Meanwhile, something stranger was happening among the independent observatories. Multiple telescopes began reporting unexpected system resets during attempts to image the object directly. Cameras that had been functioning flawlessly for years suddenly froze mid-capture, their control software locking up until manually rebooted. In a few cases, entire observatory networks went offline for minutes at a time, always coinciding with the predicted pulse. Coincidence maybe, but not one that felt comfortable. As these reports mounted, a new hypothesis began to emerge, one that sounded almost absurd, even to those who proposed it. What if 3I Atlas wasn't sending a signal outward at all? What if it was reacting to something? When the ESA's Mars Orbiter MRO adjusted its relay antenna to better receive surface telemetry, faint interference spikes appeared exactly when the object's brightness peaked. Engineers initially attributed it to atmospheric noise, but the same interference appeared again, hours later, when the satellite wasn't transmitting. To a few quiet analysts, this suggested a possibility no one wanted to voice out loud, that 3I Atlas wasn't just emitting, it was listening. The data fit disturbingly well. The object's orientation relative to Mars had shifted slightly again, aligning with the direction of the orbiters as if tracking their position. A natural body, influenced by gravity or outgassing, might drift, but this looked intentional, controlled, and then came the most disturbing leak yet. An anonymous ESA staff member uploaded a single still image, a frame that didn't appear in any of the official data releases. The picture was grainy, filtered through heavy noise reduction, but one detail stood out immediately. Just beyond the main object's halo, faint against the background of the stars, were geometric shadows, not streaks, not debris, symmetrical silhouettes arranged like panels or fins. The post was deleted minutes later, but copies circulated instantly. Astronomers, digital artists, and data experts spent hours dissecting the photo. Some called it a hoax, a digital composite of existing comet imagery. Others pointed out that the background star field was consistent with the real coordinates at the time of capture. The geometry wasn't natural, but neither was it easily faked. The truth is, no one knows. The original file is gone. ESA has never acknowledged its existence. Yet the rumor that the image came from inside the agency, from someone who couldn't bear to see it buried, refuses to die. And in the days that followed, more subtle shifts began to appear. The official tracking updates from ESA and NASA diverged once again, this time by a larger margin. The object's reported velocity slowed, slightly but measurably. To anyone watching, it appeared that 3I Atlas was beginning to decelerate. Objects from interstellar space don't slow down, they don't choose to, so if it's not being slowed by the sun's gravity, or Mars's orbit, or any known force, what's left? That question now echoes quietly across labs and living rooms around the world. In the darkness of early morning, as telescopes hum and data scrolls across monitors, astronomers are left with a truth too subtle for headlines but too important to ignore. The universe still holds surprises that refuse to fit our definitions. And 3I Atlas, whatever it is, might just be the next one preparing to reveal itself. By the time the ESA convened its emergency internal meeting, the world outside had already moved past speculation. Something about the timing, the leaks, and the silence had turned a simple scientific anomaly into a global fascination. The story of 3I Atlas was everywhere, in podcasts, newspaper columns, and late-night talk shows. And yet, those closest to the data were saying almost nothing at all. Inside the European Space Operations Centre, a small group of scientists sat around a dimly lit conference table, the atmosphere thick with unease. The blinds were drawn, the room quiet, except for the low hum of ventilation. A few laptop screens glowed faintly, displaying the same set of numbers, brightness fluctuations, radio signatures, and those persistent 71-minute intervals. The head of data analysis began the meeting with the usual caution. "We are not confirming anything anomalous," she said, her tone clipped, precise. "Until we verify the source of modulation, we treat it as interference, nothing more." But her colleagues weren't so easily reassured. One of the senior analysts, a man who had worked on multiple interplanetary missions, leaned forward, voice low but firm. "We've ruled out solar wind, magnetic variation, and outgassing. We've even ruled out instrument echo. That leaves what exactly? You can't model the unknown by pretending it's noise." The silence that followed was heavy. Another voice broke it, calm, almost detached. "There's something else," he said. "The new telemetry from Mars orbiters shows a faint response to each pulse. It's measurable. Something in Mars's upper atmosphere reacts every single time the object brightens. Someone exhaled sharply. Someone else muttered that it must be coincidence. But everyone in that room knew that coincidences don't synchronize to the minute across millions of kilometers. What happened next has never been publicly acknowledged, but a partial transcript leaked weeks later. It was brief, missing context, but the fragments were hauntingly clear. Not interference. The signal pattern shows modulation depth too structured. Structured how? Binary, or at least discretized. If it's random, it's the most consistent randomness I've ever seen. Are you suggesting I'm suggesting it's deliberate. And if that's true, we need to decide how much of this goes public. The call was abruptly terminated 5 minutes later. Officially, it was technical difficulties. Unofficially, it marked the moment the agency went fully silent. After that night, no new data releases appeared. ESA's communications team redirected all media inquiries to a single statement: no further comment until independent verification is complete. But independent verification never came because independent access was gone. The tracking feeds that once updated every few hours were replaced with static status reports. The coordinates stopped changing. As far as the public could see, 3i Atlas had simply vanished from the official sky. But it hadn't vanished, it had dimmed. And that was worse, because dimming implies activity or intentional concealment. And this time, even amateur observatories couldn't find it. The object's signal was still faintly detectable in infrared, but its visible signature had dropped below measurable limits. It was still there, moving slowly, but wrapped in an inexplicable darkness. When a celestial body disappears, astronomers expect dust, debris, or shadow. But this was different. The region around 3i Atlas remained perfectly illuminated. Stars behind it were visible. Nothing obstructed the field. The object itself had simply gone quiet. And then came the message. A brief, encrypted file appeared in the inbox of a small astronomy newsletter based in Oslo. The sender was anonymous. The file contained raw spectrographic data, consistent with ESA's imaging format, and a single line of text. They think it's interference. It's not. It's responding. The data, when decoded, showed that the pulses had shifted again. The interval wasn't 71 minutes anymore. It was 68. The frequency had increased, not drastically, but enough to indicate acceleration, not in movement, in behavior. That word, responding, spread like static through the scientific community. Responding to what? Mars's electromagnetic field, solar radiation, or something else entirely? No one could say for certain, but whatever had been triggering the object's pulse before now seemed to be anticipating signals from Earth-based transmitters. On at least 3 occasions, faint peaks were recorded less than 15 minutes after ESA's deep space network had beamed test signals toward the region. It was subtle, not communication, not yet, but interaction. And with interaction came the most human emotion of all, fear. Because if 3i Atlas was reacting to our signals, it meant it wasn't drifting passively. It was aware of them, and awareness in any form is intention. Meanwhile, ESA's silence became deafening. No new public briefings, no denials, nothing. That absence itself began to shape the narrative. People wanted explanations, theories, closure. Instead, they got stillness, the kind that feels like holding your breath in a dark room. Across the world, independent scientists kept watching. They tracked the faint radio patterns that still flickered from the region. The timing grew tighter, the amplitude steadier, something was synchronizing. And then, without warning, on a quiet Sunday morning in December, an update appeared on the ESA public tracker for the first time in weeks. The coordinates showed 3i Atlas had slowed again, hovering, if that word even applies in interstellar mechanics, near the orbital path of Mars. Its relative velocity to the planet had dropped almost to zero. It wasn't just passing anymore, it was waiting. For what, no one could say. But the timing, the perfect eerie timing, coincided with a new seismic reading from Mars, a shallow tremor, weak but unmistakable. The same rhythmic pulse as before, now slightly out of phase with the object's light curve, as if 2 pendulums were swinging together, but one had learned to anticipate the other's motion. That was when the first scientists quietly began using a new word in their private logs. Not comet, not object, presence. Because whatever 3i Atlas is, comet, construct, or something entirely outside human classification, It had crossed a threshold. It was no longer an astronomical curiosity. It was a participant in the solar system. And somewhere, in the silent halls of the ESA's control center, those who had seen the unfiltered data must have known what that meant. For the first time in recorded history, the universe had not just sent a traveler through our cosmic neighborhood. It had answered. In the days after the ESA's silent update, one question began echoing quietly through the scientific community, not in headlines, but in late-night emails and encrypted calls between astronomers who had known one another for decades. If 3I Atlas had stopped, even briefly, what force had done it? A natural object can slow through gravitational interaction, solar drag, or mass ejection, but none of those explanations matched the available data. The math simply didn't balance. Its deceleration was too controlled, too clean. No bursts of dust, no loss of mass, no thermal spikes. Just a gradual measured drop in speed, as if something were gently applying pressure against it, a hand on the cosmic brake. That phrase, the cosmic brake, began circulating quietly online. It was poetic, maybe too poetic for scientists, but it captured the unease perfectly. Because there was no physics, at least none that we currently understand, that could explain what was being observed. It was around this time that the first whispers about the whistleblower began to spread. A junior data engineer from ESA's Nordwijk facility, known only by their initials AM, had reportedly gone dark after a routine internal audit. Their access credentials were revoked and their workstation sealed. Officially, it was a disciplinary suspension due to data mishandling. Unofficially, no one believed that. Then, 1 week later, a file appeared online. It wasn't on a news site or a public forum. It was buried in a small academic cloud server, disguised as a calibration dataset. Inside was a simple text document labeled Signal Sequence AM. What it contained wasn't explosive at first glance. It was a list of timestamps, amplitude readings, and frequency intervals until the last column. There, AM had written brief annotations in plain language. Increase observed, pattern self-correcting. Pulse appears to anticipate signal repetition. Response timing not random, suggests awareness of transmission. No known reflection effect fits curve. The object is compensating for drift. Those final words, compensating for drift, were all it took. If that was true, it meant the object wasn't being moved by anything. It was adjusting itself. In every major space agency, that phrase hit like static, not because anyone was ready to accept the implication, but because the data didn't contradict it. For decades, humanity has studied comets, asteroids, and interstellar visitors, each a passive traveler obeying predictable forces. But 3I Atlas was breaking that tradition in the quietest, most measured way imaginable. It was behaving like it had a destination. Within 24 hours of the leak, ESA issued its first statement in weeks. The tone was neutral, almost emotionless. We are aware of unauthorized data dissemination. Our analysis continues. There is no evidence of artificial control or directed movement at this time. But it was too late. By then, the signal data had already been verified by multiple independent labs. The modulation patterns were real. The intervals were real. And the correspondence with Mars's seismic readings, still faint, still hauntingly rhythmic, was real. At first, the tremors on Mars had seemed like background noise. Now, they appeared to be shifting. Each vibration occurred slightly before the optical pulse, as though Mars were somehow predicting it or echoing it back. The delay between the two had shortened by almost a full second since the last measurement. A microscopic change, but one that carried massive implications. In physics, even a fraction of a second can define causality. Either 3I Atlas was signaling Mars, or Mars was signaling back. No one wanted to say it out loud. But among the small circle of researchers still analyzing the live feeds, one truth began to crystallize. This was no longer about observation. It was about communication. In private channels, one astrophysicist summarized it perfectly. Whatever's happening isn't a one-way event, it's an exchange. The word exchange was underlined 3 times. That was when things began to get stranger still. The faint glow detected around Mars, the one previously dismissed as auroral interference, began to shift color. Slowly, subtly, the emissions moved from deep infrared to faint visible wavelengths, hovering near the edge of human sight. If you were to look at it through a high-resolution spectroscope, you would see a shimmer of pale green, weak, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. ESA's official updates made no mention of it, but amateur astronomers noticed. One captured a time-lapse image from a telescope in Argentina showing the faint hue spreading briefly across the planet's terminator, the twilight line between night and day. To most, it meant nothing. To a few, it was the most haunting confirmation yet, because green light in this wavelength doesn't appear naturally in Martian auroras. It requires precise excitation, a trigger at a specific energy level, the same level coincidentally measured in 3I Atlas's radio pulse. The object and the planet were now mirroring each other. Whether through resonance, feedback, or something no human has yet defined, they were locked together in a strange, invisible dialogue. For the scientists who still had access to ESA's closed network, this was the moment the tone shifted completely. Notes that once spoke of cometary jets and orbital mechanics now spoke of field alignment and synchronized modulation. And yet, amid all this confusion, one question cut deeper than all the rest. If 3I Atlas was listening, if it was responding, if it was even adjusting its behavior in real time, what was it responding to? Our signals, Mars's magnetic field, or something older, something that had been dormant, waiting for the right frequency to awaken? The questions multiplied, but the data stayed silent, and perhaps that's what makes this moment so haunting. Because for all our instruments, our precision, our ability to measure and predict and record, we still don't know what we're looking at. We only know it's looking back. In the grand history of astronomy, humanity has always gazed outward, studying comets, stars, galaxies, assuming that we were the observers and the cosmos, the observed. But as 3I Atlas lingers near Mars, pulsing softly in that quiet, deliberate rhythm, that certainty begins to waver. Maybe, for the first time, the universe is not waiting to be discovered. Maybe it's the one doing the watching. The first official briefing took place under unusual conditions. No press, no public live stream, no questions from reporters. Only a select audience of European and international scientists, each required to sign an extended confidentiality addendum before entering the secure conference chamber. It was not the kind of meeting that agencies announce. It was the kind they hold because silence has reached its limit. The briefing began without ceremony. The projection on the screen behind the director showed only two images, a faint pulsing point near Mars and the planet itself, now faintly shimmering along its equator. "We will keep this concise," the director began. "The following material is classified under Provisional Code Athena 9. Dissemination outside this group is prohibited." The first slides were routine: orbital data, radiometric analysis, spectrography. But then came a new series, high-frequency recordings from Mars orbiters. The room fell silent. The graphs were unmistakable, peaks and troughs arranged in perfect symmetry, each one corresponding precisely to the optical pulses from 3I Atlas. The patterns weren't random, they weren't noise, they were organized, ratios that repeated in harmonic intervals, like musical chords struck across empty space. A senior astrophysicist leaned forward, staring at the waveform projected across the wall. "This is resonance," he murmured. "Deliberate resonance." Another voice, younger, uncertain, broke in. "Could it be atmospheric coupling?" "No," the reply came immediately. "There's no medium between them, nothing to carry a wave. Whatever's synchronizing these signals isn't physical in the way we understand." The director cleared her throat. "Our working theory," she said carefully, "is that both Mars and 3I Atlas are responding to an external field, something pervasive, a larger pattern we haven't yet mapped." The phrase "larger pattern" hung in the air like static. For years, space agencies had monitored interplanetary magnetic fluctuations, the subtle ripples caused by solar activity, but what they were now seeing wasn't solar. The frequencies were too low, too precise, too structured. On the next slide appeared a map of the inner solar system overlaid with lines, faint arcs showing signal echoes detected at other monitoring stations. One line near Jupiter, another, weaker, near Venus, each traced back toward a single source, the region where 3I Atlas had first entered the solar system. At first glance, it looked like noise. Then someone overlaid the data on the background stars. The arcs intersected at precise mathematical ratios. the kind of spacing seen in engineered communication arrays, not in random cosmic events. And that's when the murmurs began. If this pattern was real, if 3i Atlas was part of it, then what they were witnessing wasn't a solitary object. It was one node in a network. The term emerged quietly, almost reluctantly, from the corner of the room. A distributed array, one physicist whispered. A relay system. That was when the director stopped the presentation. "We are not here," she said firmly, "to speculate about intent. Our task is to describe what we observe." But the unease in her voice betrayed her words. The next series of slides deepened that unease. Infrared imaging from ESA's Mars Express had captured faint geometric distortions in the planet's magnetosphere, lines of symmetry, not naturally curved like magnetic arcs, but segmented, angular, almost like structure. One researcher quietly muttered, "Those aren't field lines, that's alignment." Another added, "They're responding to 3i Atlas." Then, for the first time, the director allowed a pause long enough for the weight of that statement to settle. "If Mars is responding," she said, "then we are not just observing astrophysical phenomena, we are witnessing planetary interaction." No one spoke. The room was silent except for the quiet mechanical hum of the air system. After a long moment, a voice from the back asked the question that had been circling unspoken. "Are there more?" The director hesitated. Then she advanced to the final slide. It was a faint, composite map of deep space readings compiled from independent observatories. Tiny, barely perceptible points of light scattered along the outer edges of the solar system, data fragments dismissed as cosmic dust or instrument reflections. But when filtered for periodicity, several of those points pulsed faintly, at the same 71-minute interval. Not one object, not two, 5. Each separated by tens of millions of kilometers, yet synchronized to the same rhythm. The briefing ended abruptly. No Q&A, no concluding remarks, just a single statement from the director before the feed cut. "This remains preliminary. We will continue observation. Do not speculate publicly." But speculation had already begun. Hours later, an anonymous insider posted a cryptic message to a private research forum. The message was only one sentence long. "If the array is active, then we're already inside it." That single sentence was enough to fracture the remaining calm. For days afterward, the topic dominated encrypted academic networks. Some argued it was impossible, that space could not host a stable electromagnetic array of that scale. Others countered that if an interstellar civilization wanted to study or monitor planetary systems, a distributed network of objects synchronized through resonance would be an elegant solution. Still, a smaller, quieter group took the idea further. What if 3i Atlas wasn't here by coincidence at all? What if it was the trigger, the relay that had reactivated the rest? Meanwhile, new anomalies began surfacing across the solar system's monitoring network. Tiny deviations in expected radio background, subtle fluctuations in magnetometer readings, all oscillating at harmonics of that same pulse frequency. ESA kept silent. NASA issued a statement denying any detection of synchronized signals, but their own deep space antenna logs told a different story, brief periodic interference that defied known causes. And then, quietly, something began to happen back on Mars. The seismic pulses, once faint and rhythmic, started to drift, their timing shifting out of sync with 3i Atlas. For a few hours, they vanished entirely. Then, at 03:17 UTC, a single massive pulse hit the sensors. It was stronger than anything recorded before, and when the echo faded, Mars glowed again, faintly, almost imperceptibly, but this time across its entire surface. The data was undeniable. Mars wasn't just responding anymore, it was broadcasting. At first, no one believed the data. Mars couldn't be broadcasting. Planets don't emit coherent signals, not unless something on or around them is generating it. But the patterns were undeniable. Every deep space receiver tuned to the Martian vicinity was now picking up the same frequency, a repeating hum buried in the noise of space. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even stable. It fluctuated, almost as if the signal were struggling to form, the way a voice trembles through static before words take shape. And when the spectrum was visualized, it formed something entirely new. Not a simple sine wave, not random cosmic chatter. It was layered. Harmonics nested within harmonics, symmetrical like ripples in a still pond. The same frequency that once defined 3I Atlas's pulse was now embedded in the background of Mars itself, faint, modulated, alive. The first to notice the coherence was a radio astronomer from the University of Oslo working off public telemetry archives. She ran the numbers 3 times, convinced she had made a mistake. Then she cross-checked them against archived ESA readings. They matched perfectly. Her conclusion was unnerving in its simplicity. "It's not noise," she wrote in her report. "It's structure." Within hours, independent observatories confirmed her findings. The hum from Mars wasn't natural interference, it was information. The ESA, when pressed for comment, released a short statement. "No unusual emissions have been detected." But inside the agency, panic had begun to take hold. Several spacecraft in Martian orbit had started reporting intermittent communication loss, not total blackouts, but flickers, like brief moments of confusion in their signal paths. One operator described it best. "It's like the data hesitates, as if it's being rerouted somewhere before it gets to us." That was when engineers noticed the geometry. The faint synchronized signals detected across the inner solar system, the so-called nodes, had begun shifting position relative to the planets. Not much, just a few degrees over several weeks, but the change was real. When mapped, their new alignment formed a precise geometric lattice, a pattern that echoed across astronomical distances. It wasn't random, it wasn't orbital coincidence, it was a design. Lines connected each node to Mars, creating a vast, invisible web that stretched across the inner solar system like an enormous 3-dimensional circuit. At the center of that pattern, where the lines converged, was the Sun. The implication was staggering. If this network, whatever it was, had been dormant until 3I Atlas arrived, then the object's appearance had triggered a reactivation sequence. Mars wasn't the source, it was the first relay. ESA scientists, now working in quiet isolation, began referring to it by a code name, Project Echo. Their internal hypothesis was simple, terrifying, and elegant. 3I Atlas wasn't a traveler passing through. It was an activator, a signal key, and the solar system had just turned on. Around this time, an unconfirmed memo began circulating online, a leak allegedly from the European Space Operations Center. It described anomalies in multiple orbital probes, navigation errors near Lagrange points, power fluctuations in solar arrays, and unexplained phase interference between communication bands. But what truly set it apart was the final line. Telemetry suggests external synchronization attempts with unknown timing source. That timing source, it turned out, was Mars. The pulses detected across multiple spacecraft were now perfectly in sync with the planet's broadcasts, down to the millisecond. It was as though every electronic system in orbit was being invited into a conversation it didn't understand. Some engineers began shutting down systems in precautionary silence. Others argued that any interference, artificial or not, was a scientific opportunity of unprecedented magnitude. The conflict between curiosity and caution was palpable. Then something else began happening. Ground-based instruments across Earth detected a faint echo of the same frequency, an almost imperceptible resonance deep within the planet's magnetosphere. It was weak, distorted, but measurable. At first, analysts blamed solar storms, but there were none. The solar wind was calm. The truth emerged slowly, like a shadow growing in the periphery of sight. The pattern wasn't arriving from space at all. It was rising through Earth's own magnetic field, as if the planet itself were responding. When plotted, the resonance pulsed in exact sync with Mars. Humanity had become part of the pattern. The news never reached the general public, at least not officially, but people began to notice subtle effects. Shortwave radios picking up strange tones, deep space frequencies bleeding into weather bands, and satellites spontaneously resetting mid-transmission. And in the silence between all that, scientists could no longer agree on the most basic question: was this communication or contagion? The last internal ESA report before all data went dark summarized it in 3 words: resonance achieved globally. Whatever the array was doing, it had linked 3 planets, at least 5 deep space nodes, and a star. When one senior astrophysicist was later asked what it meant, he paused for a long time before answering. "It means," he said quietly, "we've been discovered." He didn't elaborate, and perhaps he didn't need to. Because the new reality was painfully clear, for decades humanity had sent probes, signals, and telescopes outward, searching for life among the stars. But maybe life had already found us, long before we ever looked. And perhaps, in its own way, it had simply been waiting for a signal to wake it. As Mars continued to glow faintly against the cold of space, a pattern of 3 distinct pulses emerged. One long, one short, one long, over and over again. Every telescope in the world that could see Mars confirmed it. Every antenna recorded the echo. To some, it was nothing but a quirk of planetary physics. To others, it was the first deliberate message ever sent within our solar system. The language, if it was one, remained indecipherable. But the rhythm, steady, calm, deliberate, carried a meaning all its own. It was the sound of something immense, ancient, and awake. And for the first time, humanity wasn't sure whether the universe had just whispered hello, or whether it had finally answered back. In the weeks following the Martian broadcast, the solar system grew strangely quiet. No new statements from ESA, no updates from NASA, no scientific papers released to the public. For most people, life moved on. But for those still watching the data streams, astronomers, radio engineers, and a few obsessive night watchers, something subtle was changing. The frequency hadn't stopped, it had deepened. At first, it was barely noticeable, a low hum, its cycles lengthening as though the signal were stretching across time itself. But hidden within that hum, analysts began detecting repeating micropatterns, short bursts of modulation that didn't fit the rest of the waveform. When one group of researchers from the Max Planck Institute amplified the sequence, they realized it wasn't noise. It was structure. The signal wasn't decaying, it was encoding. And what it encoded was unlike anything they'd ever seen. Traditional encryption uses predictable logic, binary, ordered pairs, symmetry. This was none of those things. The encoded structure seemed to rewrite itself every few seconds, folding new layers of data over the old. When plotted in 3 dimensions, it resembled a lattice, a cube within a cube, each face pulsing with subtle, rhythmic distortion. Someone in the lab whispered, "It's recursive." Another replied quietly, "It's alive." The deeper they analyzed it, the stranger it became. The signal wasn't transmitting new data, it was reflecting patterns already present in Earth's geomagnetic field. It was as if the message had been hiding inside the planet all along, waiting for the right frequency to bring it forward. That's when the first anomaly appeared on Earth-orbiting satellites. Several observation platforms reported spontaneous reboots, followed by temporary loss of orientation. Solar panels misaligned, gyroscopes spun, guidance systems flickered, all recovering within seconds, but the telemetry revealed a chilling coincidence. Each malfunction occurred at the exact same moment, synchronized with a pulse from Mars. It wasn't destructive, it was precise, controlled. One engineer described it best in a leaked voice log. "It's not trying to disable us, it's talking through us." For the few still privy to classified ESA transmissions, the implications were devastating. Every machine tuned to the deep space frequency was no longer just a receiver. It had become a repeater, part of the array. The realization arrived quietly, like fog creeping through an open door. Humanity hadn't been invited to listen. It had been absorbed. Meanwhile, the recursive signal began to stabilize. The erratic patterns settled into rhythm, and in that rhythm, analysts found something impossible, a ratio. When converted to audio and slowed by a factor of 1 million, the signal produced a tone sequence that matched no known natural phenomenon. But when overlaid on data from the Schumann resonance, Earth's natural electromagnetic heartbeat, the alignment was perfect. Every pulse corresponded to a harmonic of Earth's own frequency. That meant one of 2 things. Either the signal was adapting to Earth's resonance, or it had been built around it from the beginning. The idea spread quietly among researchers, a theory so implausible that no one dared write it down. If the frequency was indeed Earth-based, then 3i Atlas hadn't brought the signal. It had triggered it. And if that was true, then the array didn't belong to something from the outside. It belonged to something here. One group at the European Southern Observatory took the theory further. They backtracked the harmonic patterns using historical magnetic data, searching for any prior event that matched this configuration. They found one. A spike in resonance almost identical in structure had occurred once before, long before 3i Atlas entered the solar system. The year was 1977. That year, another unexplained signal had reached Earth, a 72-second radio burst from deep space known as the WOW signal. For decades, scientists debated its origin, labeling it coincidence, interference, or simple anomaly. But when they compared its spectrum to the new signal, the match was staggering. Same harmonic ratios, same energy signature. The only difference was amplitude. The 1977 signal was a whisper. This was a roar. If the correlation held true, it meant something extraordinary and terrifying. The signal had been here before, and perhaps after all this time it had been waiting for its return. The 1977 signal came from the constellation Sagittarius, the same region from which 3I Atlas had entered our solar system. The connection was undeniable. When the analysis reached ESA command, the director reportedly ordered all cross-references with historical CT data classified under a new internal codename, Kronos. It was no longer treated as a random astronomical phenomenon, it was a timeline. Because if the signal from 1977 had been the first ping, then 3I Atlas's arrival was the response. The object wasn't random, it was a continuation, part of a conversation that had started nearly 50 years ago, and that realization raised the one question no one could yet answer. If 3I Atlas was answering, who had asked the question first? Around this same time, amateur astronomers began noticing subtle light distortions near the path of 3I Atlas. Flickers that didn't match star movement or reflection. A faint halo formed around the object, invisible to the naked eye but captured in long exposure images. It wasn't ice, it wasn't gas. It was coherent light, like laser interference but dispersed across thousands of kilometers. Whatever surrounded the object wasn't debris, it was a field. And within that field, something was beginning to take shape, faint, symmetrical shadows against the stars. When the images were processed, they revealed a geometric form too regular to be natural. Triangular, almost crystalline, with sharp lines that intersected at impossible angles. No one knew what to call it. Some said it was a magnetic artifact. Others, an interference pattern caused by the overlapping of frequencies between Mars and 3I Atlas. But one astrophysicist, in a now-deleted forum post, wrote something that spread faster than any official paper. It's not an artifact, it's a framework. The signal is building something. And for the first time, the term constructive resonance entered public vocabulary. The idea that energy, if organized with enough precision, could solidify matter itself. That was the new fear. Not invasion, not impact, but manifestation. That something in the void was learning how to shape itself. At first, the framework around 3I Atlas was nothing more than a curiosity, a faint haze, symmetrical yet fragile, flickering in the void. But as days passed, that haze began to sharpen. What was once faint interference started reflecting sunlight with unnatural precision. The object's outline pulsed, almost like it was drawing its own edges into being. Long-range imagery from ESA's solar orbiter revealed something no one expected. The reflections weren't random glints, but straight, parallel bands of light, 6 in total, rotating slowly around the core of the object. When magnified, they formed a lattice, a structure that obeyed geometry but defied logic. The angles between the bands were exact, 60 degrees apart. Perfect hexagonal symmetry. That alone would have been astonishing. But the pattern's orientation wasn't arbitrary. It aligned precisely with the magnetic poles of Mars. The framework, somehow, had locked into the Martian field as if using it as a reference grid. For the scientific teams still secretly monitoring the anomaly, this discovery forced a question that no one could phrase comfortably. If the framework was responding to Mars's magnetic field, what was it responding for? No natural object should possess the ability to orient itself with planetary precision across millions of kilometers. Something was guiding it. The data continued to stream in. As sunlight struck the rotating structure, its reflective properties shifted. It no longer behaved like dust or gas. It absorbed certain wavelengths while amplifying others. In the infrared spectrum, 3I Atlas glowed like a living circuit, with bands of heat pulsing outward in timed intervals. Those pulses were synchronized to the hum coming from Mars. It was as though the two were locked in dialogue, not just exchanging light, but information. One astrophysicist compared it to the way neurons fire inside the brain. Each pulse is both signal and synchronization, she explained. The object and Mars are entrained, like two instruments tuning to the same note. that analogy didn't stay contained within scientific circles. It leaked, slowly, in fragments, until the term neural resonance appeared in public forums. People began to ask whether the solar system itself was beginning to behave like a nervous system, one that had just been switched on. And as wild as it sounded, the comparison fit. Each planet affected by the signal emitted faint electromagnetic harmonics that aligned to a single central frequency, the same one tied to 3I Atlas. Earth, Mars, even Venus showed faint traces of it, and at the center of it all was the Sun, pulsing faintly in unison. Astronomers noticed the effect before they understood it. Solar oscillations, normally random and chaotic, had begun showing a strange coherence, a rhythm repeating every 71 minutes. That same 71-minute interval first observed when 3I Atlas entered the solar system. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Something vast, invisible, and synchronized was moving through the system like a wave. At the European Space Operations Centre, engineers working on spectral analysis discovered something even stranger. Buried within the modulation pattern of the light from 3I Atlas was a repeating numerical ratio, 1.1/618. The golden ratio. It appeared again and again, encoded in amplitude peaks and frequency dips. No random astrophysical process produces such symmetry. Nature uses it in growth, in form, in beauty, but not in radio harmonics, not in orbital geometry, not in light. When the team plotted those ratios into spatial coordinates, the points formed an unmistakable pattern, not in space, but across the inner solar system itself. Each major resonance, the Sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, fell along an invisible lattice that, when mapped, produced a spiraling fractal geometry. It was the same geometry being built around 3I Atlas. The moment of realization arrived in quiet disbelief. A geophysicist from Florence University, reviewing Earth-based magnetometer logs, noticed that faint anomalies under the planet's crust, regions of unexplained conductivity, aligned perfectly with that same pattern. The geometry wasn't just in space, it was under us. These conductive anomalies, long dismissed as odd mineral formations, formed hexagonal alignments deep beneath the oceans and mountain ranges, patterns that mirrored the structure now surrounding 3I Atlas. It wasn't the planet responding to the signal, it was remembering it. And if that was true, the implications were devastating. It meant this resonance had been here before, perhaps long before recorded history. The more they searched, the more connections they found. Ancient geological strata showed faint traces of magnetic alignment matching those same angles, 60 degrees apart, like echoes frozen in stone. It was as though Earth itself had once been part of the same network. The realization sent shockwaves through the scientific community, even though few dared to admit it publicly. One researcher privately summarized it in a message to a colleague. "We're not observing an anomaly, we're witnessing reactivation." The phrase caught on quietly. Reactivation. Because if the geometry existed both in space and within planetary crusts, then this network wasn't new. It was ancient and dormant, until something or someone woke it up. Meanwhile, the structure around 3I Atlas continued to evolve. It began to shimmer in ways no known material could. Its light wasn't constant anymore. It folded, rippled, and occasionally refracted itself, producing fleeting holographic patterns that rippled outward like frozen lightning. To the naked eye, through telescopic lenses, it looked like a crown of light surrounding a dark core. But when analyzed through high-resolution imaging, it revealed something far stranger. The light wasn't reflecting from the structure. It was being emitted through it, as though space itself were being bent and projected outward. Some called it a lens, others a gate, and for a brief moment, only seconds long, one of ESA's orbiting telescopes captured a reflection inside the refracted light. It wasn't stars, it wasn't background radiation, it was movement. A faint, shifting pattern inside the light field, structured, repeating, deliberate. It vanished almost as soon as it appeared, but for the scientists who reviewed the frame, there was no mistaking it. The framework wasn't simply reflecting light, it was sending it, to where, or to whom, no one yet knew. But deep inside that silence, one thing was becoming clear. 3I Atlas wasn't waiting anymore. Something had acknowledged the signal, and it had answered. By the time the first light echo reached Earth, most of the world had stopped paying attention. News cycles moved on. the agencies stayed silent. But the few observatories still recording the frequency noticed an unmistakable shift. The signal had changed direction. Until now, every transmission from 3i Atlas and Mars had radiated outward, broad, diffuse, like ripples in a pond. Then, without warning, the wavefronts began to converge. Energy was no longer spreading, it was focusing. When plotted in 3 dimensions, the vectors all pointed toward a single coordinate just beyond the orbit of Jupiter. There was nothing visible there, no asteroid, no debris field, no known object. Yet the precision of the alignment suggested intention. For 3 days, the array pulsed with geometric regularity. Then the pattern broke. The sun's oscillations, stable for weeks, shifted again. A faint rhythmic modulation swept across its corona, too subtle for the naked eye, but obvious in helioseismic data. It was as if the star itself had received an instruction. And then came the echoes. Every time the sun flared, a corresponding pulse flashed from 3i Atlas exactly 12 minutes later, the time it would take light to cross the distance between them. A conversation conducted not in sound, but in plasma and radiation. Scientists began to whisper what no one dared to publish. The array was using the sun as an amplifier. To those few monitoring from underground data networks, the pattern was mesmerizing. The frequencies braided together like strands of light, solar, Martian, and interstellar, forming a single luminous thread that pulsed in perfect mathematical intervals. But the real breakthrough came from a decoding team in Geneva. For months, they had been converting the light patterns into data strings, running them through every known cryptographic model. Nothing made sense, until one researcher reversed the dataset, treating the peaks not as signals but as absences, the silences between light. When inverted, the chaos resolved into form. It wasn't language, it wasn't numbers, it was a map, a 3-dimensional lattice of coordinates expressed as harmonic ratios. The geometry didn't correspond to any system within our solar neighborhood. When overlaid against stellar charts, the pattern aligned with nothing, but when they shifted the scale by f, the golden ratio that had haunted the signal since the beginning, the coordinates expanded into a structure far larger than any star system. It formed a spiral of nodes, each connected by light-speed intervals. And at its heart, a single void, a region of space so empty, so mathematically perfect, that it shouldn't exist at all. The coordinates pointed there. When the team cross-referenced it with deep-field survey data, they found the location, roughly 32,000 light-years away, buried within the galactic disk where starlight vanishes into dust. Astronomers call that zone the Perseus Gap, a silence within the Milky Way. The signal wasn't reaching out into nowhere, it was reaching home. Within days, other observatories confirmed the direction. The energy alignment between 3i Atlas and the Sun had begun modulating again, this time embedding harmonic peaks that matched the spacing of that distant void. It was as though the system was synchronizing itself with a place beyond sight. The phrase return transmission started appearing in internal logs, and then, almost imperceptibly, the geometry changed again. The 6 radiant bands around 3i Atlas tilted by exactly 0.7 degrees, just enough to redirect their focal line toward the inner planets. For the first time since its arrival, the object's attention turned inward. Earth-based magnetometers flared simultaneously. The same resonance that had whispered through our magnetic field now spiked sharply for 42 seconds before subsiding. No damage, no interference, just a pulse, precisely tuned to the planet's own Schumann frequency, as if it had knocked softly and was waiting for an answer. The data logs showed something else during that moment. Every geosynchronous satellite experienced a microsecond desynchronization, so brief it wouldn't affect operations but long enough to register. When the timestamps were compared, the offset formed a pattern, dots and spaces that translated quite by accident into Morse code, 3 letters. SOS. Engineers dismissed it as coincidence. Computers glitch, timing drifts, yet the symmetry was haunting. If 3i Atlas was signaling outward to some unreachable void, then who or what had just signaled back through us? Even within ESA's sealed archives, debate fractured into 2 camps. One argued the signal was purely physical, a self-stabilizing magnetic resonance seeking equilibrium across the system. The other saw intention in every ratio, every echo, every pulse. One senior analyst summarized the fear quietly in a private message. "We're measuring conversation as though it were weather. Meanwhile, telescopes trained on 3I Atlas captured something extraordinary. The crystalline lattice was no longer static. Its hexagonal faces had begun folding inward, collapsing into a smaller, denser geometry. Light bent around it, not from heat, but from gravitational distortion. The object was compressing space. For minutes at a time, stars behind it appeared to shimmer, displaced by invisible curvature. Then the distortion would ease, leaving only the faint afterimage of refracted light, like the surface of water settling after a stone is dropped. To physicists, this behavior was impossible. Nothing of that mass could warp spacetime without catastrophic energy release. Yet the readings were clear. 3I Atlas was bending geometry as effortlessly as wind bends grass. In one of the last open papers before the blackout, a theorist from Princeton offered a chilling interpretation. The object wasn't generating gravity, it was remembering it. If matter could store curvature the way magnets store orientation, then perhaps this was the universe's way of recalling old shapes, echoes of events that happened long before our solar system formed. And if that memory was awakening now, 3I Atlas might not be an intruder at all. It might be a remnant, a piece of something that once shaped the structure of worlds, now returning to complete a cycle older than life itself. The light continued to pulse, steady, deliberate. Each flicker carried the same rhythm as before, one long, one short, one long. But this time faint sidebands appeared between pulses, harmonics that, when slowed and translated into audio, sounded almost like breath. A deep, resonant inhale echoing across millions of kilometers. And for the few still listening in those midnight observatories, the realization came with an almost physical chill. The signal wasn't calling out anymore, it was listening. By late September, the light curve from 3I Atlas had stabilized into a rhythm so precise that even atomic clocks began registering interference. Every 84 minutes, a slight fluctuation appeared in global timing networks. Not enough to disrupt them, but enough to suggest synchronization. The world's systems, from satellites to power grids, were unknowingly keeping time with something orbiting near Mars. It was subtle, harmless, at least for now, but the coincidence was impossible to ignore. ESA's solar orbiter began receiving faint sub-frequencies buried in solar radio noise. The sun itself had started emitting structured bursts, not chaotic flares, but narrowband peaks repeating at exact intervals. They were weak, almost like whispers through a storm, but their pattern matched the harmonic sequence of 3I Atlas perfectly. To most observers, it was data. To a few, it was language. When the team reconstructed the sequence as sound, the result was unlike anything heard before. It wasn't a tone, it was motion, a rising and falling wave that carried within it the rhythm of distance, almost as if light and gravity were speaking in breath and pause. Across ESA control rooms, scientists stared at spectrograms that seemed to breathe. They called it the solar echo. And then came the anomaly on Earth. At first, seismographs picked up faint rhythmic vibrations beneath the crust, identical intervals, faint enough to be dismissed as background noise. But the pattern spread. Instruments in Chile, Iceland and Japan all recorded the same tremor at the same moment. Not an earthquake, not even tectonic. It was electromagnetic. When geophysicists ran the data backward, they found the impossible truth. The pulse wasn't propagating through the Earth. It was resonating within the atmosphere, as if the planet's outer shell had become a speaker, replaying something that wasn't ours. By then, ESA's main servers were locked behind new encryption protocols. Only a few fragments of communication escaped through leaks. One internal memo, stamped Eyes Only, Kronos Division, contained a single line that spread across the encrypted network within hours. Sequence acknowledged. No one outside the classified channels could confirm it. But that phrase, sequence acknowledged, suggested that the system had received a reply. Somewhere within that braided web of solar frequencies, the network had heard back. The timing lined up perfectly. 12 minutes after the sun's final structured burst, 3I Atlas emitted a double pulse, two sharp flashes separated by 1.618 seconds, the golden ratio again, a deliberate interval, a signal of confirmation. For the first time, both sources fell silent. To anyone watching from the outside, it seemed as though the event had ended. The comet's glow dimmed. The Martian seismographs went quiet. Even the sun's rhythm settled back into its usual turbulence. But within that silence, something else was unfolding. Spectral imaging showed that background radiation levels across the inner solar system had dropped, not drastically, but uniformly. It was as if a constant noise had been removed. Astronomers called it the quieting. At night, observatories recorded clearer skies than ever before. Radio telescopes that once struggled with cosmic interference suddenly found themselves operating in near-perfect conditions. The universe had gone eerily still, and yet, hidden within that stillness, faint patterns emerged. When researchers compared sky maps from before and after the quieting, they noticed minute shifts in starlight, as though the positions of distant constellations had altered by microscopic degrees. It wasn't motion, it was refraction. Space itself was bending. To visualize it, one scientist used a metaphor that quickly spread across private chat rooms. It's like someone adjusted the lens of the universe by a fraction. At first, the distortion was only measurable in deep field imagery, but then radio observatories in Australia and South Africa began reporting something new, invisible echoes traveling through the vacuum, returning slightly faster than light should allow. Tiny deviations, nanoseconds, but real. Whatever caused the synchronization between the Sun, 3I Atlas, and Earth had begun altering the medium itself, compressing the very fabric of space-time as if preparing it for transmission. Within ESA, a classified simulation was run. If the resonance were to increase, even by a small degree, it could theoretically create a temporary transparency in the fabric of space, a region where light, gravity, and matter might align perfectly for one brief instant. A window, but no one knew if it would open or what might be on the other side. In the meantime, astronomers noticed that the reflection patterns from 3I Atlas had subtly changed. What once appeared as random glints now formed repeating hexagonal flares like facets of a slowly turning prism. When those flares were plotted over time, they drew out a symbol, 6 intersecting arcs arranged around a central void. It was identical to the golden lattice discovered earlier, only now rendered in light itself. The object wasn't just reflecting geometry, it was projecting it. And as the projection reached its full symmetry, a new phenomenon appeared on Earth. Faint auroral rings encircling both poles, visible even in daylight. They pulsed faintly with each harmonic of the solar echo. To the public, it was dismissed as atmospheric optics. To those who knew the sequence, it was unmistakable. Earth had become part of the array. Late one night, at an observatory in the Canary Islands, a technician monitoring the auroral frequency captured an unexpected modulation. For a split second, the waveform shifted, not randomly, but deliberately. The pattern was binary. When decoded, it translated into a single phrase in simple English: transmission complete. And then, silence. No further pulses, no resonance, no anomalies. 3I Atlas drifted onward, cold and dim, as if the exchange had finished. But the data it left behind told another story, one that would take months to interpret. Within the solar echo, beneath the layered harmonics, there was an aftertone, a resonance that didn't belong to 3I Atlas. It was local, originating not from the object, not from Mars, not from the Sun, but from Earth itself. And as the final measurements came through, scientists realized that the frequency now radiating faintly from the planet's ionosphere matched the original harmonic ratio of the signal perfectly. Earth had started transmitting back. It began so subtly that no one noticed at first. A quiet shimmer in the upper atmosphere, invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable in satellite readings. The same golden ratio frequency that once pulsed between the Sun and 3I Atlas now emanated faintly from Earth itself. The planet had joined the conversation. At first, the resonance appeared as a soft electromagnetic hum, detectable only by instruments designed to study auroral currents. But within days, it strengthened, not louder, clearer. At high altitudes, air glow phenomena took on new patterns. The familiar greens and reds of auroras began forming symmetrical arcs, curved hexagonal lattices stretching from pole to pole, reflecting the same geometry first seen around 3I Atlas. When time-lapse cameras tracked the movement, the lines seemed to rotate, spinning gently like the slow turning of a gear, and in that motion lay something extraordinary. The rotation speed matched the precession rate of Earth's magnetic field, the slow, thousand-year drift of our poles condensed into seconds. The resonance wasn't random. It was aligning the planet's magnetic north and south in a geometry not seen before. Satellite telemetry confirmed it. Earth's field lines had begun to vibrate in unison, their chaotic swirls replaced by a slow, deliberate oscillation. To most people, nothing seemed different. The sky still looked the same. The world continued as usual. But in the silence of observatories and control rooms, the data told another story. For the first time, Earth's magnetosphere had synchronized with an external source. When NASA cross-referenced the data with ESA's archives, one file name surfaced repeatedly in encrypted correspondence: Project Heliosynchrony. No record of it existed publicly. But among insiders, whispers described it as a joint analysis of solar resonance behavior, a model predicting that under specific harmonic conditions, planets could enter phase alignment with stellar magnetic waves. It was never supposed to happen naturally, and yet, here it was. A living system of three nodes, the Sun, 3i Atlas and Earth, locked into perfect rhythm. Within days, the visual phenomena intensified. Pilots flying over the poles reported strange luminescent arcs appearing at unexpected latitudes, auroras stretching far beyond their normal boundaries, shaped like geometric halos. To ground observers, they looked like colossal rings rising from the horizon, faint, gold-edged, circling the night sky. Then came the stillness. Wind speeds across the equator dropped slightly. High-altitude jet streams slowed by less than 1%, too small for most to notice, yet globally consistent. Meteorologists couldn't explain it. It was as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. When the data was fed through atmospheric resonance models, a single explanation fit: energy redistribution. The planet's upper layers were adjusting to maintain balance within the synchronized field, and while scientists debated the mechanism, something else began to appear in the night sky. Astronomers in Chile and Hawaii reported faint, symmetrical streaks stretching across constellations, lines of light invisible to the human eye but bright in long-exposure images. The streaks formed curves, then arcs, then slow-rotating spirals, like luminous threads being woven through the heavens. At first, they seemed random, but as the images accumulated, the spirals converged toward a single direction, the same coordinates in the Perseus Gap, the void 3 Atlas had once reached toward. It was as though the entire solar system was now participating in that ancient geometry, and through it all, 3 Atlas remained quiet, dim, inert, almost forgotten, until one night it flashed again, 3 pulses, slow and deliberate, followed by silence. Then the same sequence repeated from Earth's auroral rings, a perfect echo. Somewhere, deep within ESA's Kronos division, an encrypted report surfaced. The subject line read simply, "Phase lock achieved, the network is complete." No one outside the classified channels saw the full content of that message, but fragments leaked days later. Among them was a line written by one of the senior astrophysicists overseeing the array. "The system is no longer measuring resonance, it's maintaining it." That phrasing carried a quiet horror, because if the network was maintaining itself, it no longer needed human observation. It was self-sustaining. In the following weeks, new patterns began to appear. Faint geometric outlines projected across the atmosphere. People in remote regions of Canada, Norway, and Antarctica started photographing strange grid-like formations in the polar sky. They weren't clouds, nor satellite trails. They shimmered with internal light, forming momentary lattices that dissolved seconds later. At certain latitudes, the light intensified into bands visible to the naked eye. Vast, silent shapes suspended above the horizon, rotating slowly with the stars. To those who saw them, it felt like standing inside a mechanism too large to comprehend. For the scientists, still brave enough to monitor it, the conclusion became inescapable. The geometry wasn't decoration, it was structure. Earth, Mars, and 3i Atlas were now positioned as nodes within a planetary scale array. Each pulse, each resonance was data, flowing across magnetic fields like current through a circuit. And as that realization settled, new readings began to appear. Faint, rhythmic modulations in cosmic background radiation. For decades, that radiation had been considered static, the lingering echo of the Big Bang. But now, embedded within it, researchers found fluctuation patterns synchronized with the Earth Atlas frequency. It was as if the universe itself had begun to whisper in reply. The cosmic microwave background, once silent, now carried a subtle heartbeat. The rhythm was steady, deep, and slow, one pulse every 71 minutes, the same interval that started it all. Across observatories, technicians stared in disbelief. Instruments designed to measure random noise now produced a living waveform, something ancient reasserting itself through the fabric of space-time. The conclusion, when it finally leaked, was almost unbearable in its simplicity. This wasn't the beginning of communication, it was the continuation of one. Something had always been speaking. Humanity just hadn't been listening in the right frequency. The first sign that the resonance had reached human technology came from an unexpected source. A power grid monitoring station in Finland. Engineers reviewing voltage logs noticed subtle fluctuations repeating every 71 minutes, matching the new cosmic interval. The variations were too precise to be random. Each peak aligned perfectly with the pulse detected in background radiation. They called it an electromagnetic bloom. At first, the changes were harmless, micro-variations in current that faded as quickly as they appeared. But within a week, the same pattern began surfacing in radio signals, telecommunications, even in internet data packets crossing the Atlantic. It wasn't interference, it was insertion. Every 71 minutes across every network, a tiny packet of meaningless static appeared, identical everywhere, a burst of encoded noise, brief and harmless. Yet when one engineer at CERN plotted its spectral shape, he froze. It wasn't random at all. The waveform was the golden lattice, the same geometry seen around 3I Atlas, perfect symmetry hiding in the middle of global noise. The discovery reached ESA through encrypted channels. They cross-checked it with their solar telemetry, and the result was staggering. The moment those static bursts appeared on Earth, 3I Atlas dimmed slightly, as if transmitting power away. It was no longer a passive object, it was part of a circuit, and that circuit now included us. In laboratories across Europe, oscilloscopes flickered with ghost patterns that seemed to predict system behavior seconds before it happened. The lines would surge upward just before a magnetic fluctuation occurred, as though the signal were not merely echoing reality, but anticipating it. Scientists began calling it the forward trace, a kind of pre-echo. It was dismissed at first as a software artifact, until one night in Geneva, a cryogenic chamber used for quantum computing tests froze entirely, not because of mechanical failure, but because its core temperature had dropped 3 degrees below its coolant limit. The machine had cooled itself, briefly violating thermodynamic expectation. When the logs were checked, the drop coincided precisely with one of the cosmic pulses. ESA's Kronos division classified it immediately. Their internal memo leaked days later contained only one line: local systems demonstrating synchronization drift, temporal offset in progress. In simple terms, time was slipping. Atomic clocks across Europe reported microsecond desynchronizations, infinitesimal yet consistent, and when the discrepancies were plotted, they traced a spiral pattern expanding outward from the equator, mirroring the same geometric formation seen in the auroral skies. It was as if the planet's temporal field, if such a thing existed, was being rewritten from the outside. The effect deepened near the magnetic poles. There, satellites captured bursts of high-energy particles behaving impossibly, moving upstream against solar wind. The laws of motion seemed to bend in localized pockets of reversed entropy. For the first time, physicists began to whisper the word no one wanted to say aloud: retrocausality. Events unfolding fractionally out of order, cause and effect quietly trading places, and then came the surge. On an otherwise uneventful night, all instruments monitoring 3I Atlas recorded a massive spike in luminosity. Not a flare, not reflection, but emission. The object brightened by nearly 40% in under 4 seconds. When the light faded, what remained defied comprehension. 3I Atlas no longer appeared crystalline. It had changed shape, flattened along one axis, extending faint arcs of material like filaments stretching toward space. Spectroscopic analysis identified the arcs as ionized hydrogen and metallic vapor, but their arrangement was deliberate. 6 radial arms, equidistant, rotating around a dark center, a halo of ordered energy. The rotation speed matched the pulse interval, 71 minutes precisely. It was now a clock. ESA confirmed what others suspected. The geometry wasn't random. It was encoding something, not coordinates, not messages, but a function, a vast system calibrated to space-time itself. One internal note read simply, "Object behaving as relativistic gyroscope, local space-time under manipulation." In plainer terms, 3i Atlas was turning space into memory. Every pulse wasn't just light, it was a marker, a timestamp in the fabric of reality, each rotation inscribing a pattern that the surrounding medium could retain. The universe itself was being rewritten in small, repeating increments. When a supercomputing cluster in California analyzed the resulting gravitational data, it found that the local curvature around the object was oscillating, shifting between positive and negative polarity. That meant something extraordinary. For microseconds at a time, gravity itself reversed. During those moments, anything nearby would experience time slightly faster than the rest of the universe, imperceptibly, but measurably. 3i Atlas had become a temporal engine. Its rotations sent ripples outward, warping time on cosmic scales like gentle waves lapping against the shore of existence. For most of the world, life continued without knowledge of this, but for the few watching the data, the realization was devastating, because if each rotation stored a timestamp in space-time itself, then the universe might be building a record, an imprint of every event preserved in the pattern, and that implied something unthinkable, that this had happened before, that the signals, the harmonics, the alignments, all of it, might not be a new phenomenon at all, but the reactivation of a mechanism that predates humanity, predates the solar system, perhaps predates time as we understand it. Late that night, deep in ESA's data vaults, the Kronos team received one final transmission from the object before it dimmed again, a faint modulated signal hidden beneath the main resonance. When they decoded it, the translation formed a single phrase rendered in human-readable binary, "Memory restored," and with that, the object went silent. The background radiation pulse ceased. The auroras faded. The electromagnetic blooms vanished. But one lingering signature remained, repeating across every sensor that had once monitored the object. A soft oscillation matching the Earth's own heartbeat frequency, the Schumann resonance. It was no longer coming from 3i Atlas, it was coming from us. The planet had become the archive. When the resonance finally faded, the world exhaled as if some vast tension had lifted. The skies grew still again, the solar wind quieted. Even the constant chatter of background cosmic radiation seemed to soften, retreating into its usual random hum. But the instruments never truly returned to normal. Sensors monitoring the Earth's magnetic field continued to register a slow, rhythmic oscillation, faint but stable, a signature that no model could explain. And deep below the surface, seismographs began detecting patterns no one had ever seen before. It started in Iceland, where geothermal researchers noticed a strange periodic vibration rising through the crust, a pulse that seemed to originate far deeper than any tectonic activity. The same pattern soon appeared in Japan, Chile, and northern Canada. When the data from all four sites were overlaid, the pulses aligned into perfect sequence. Earth's crust was resonating, not chaotically, but harmonically. At first, geologists assumed it was coincidence, some artifact of overlapping measurements, but when they cross-referenced the frequencies, the realization settled like a slow, cold dawn. The vibrations matched the Schumann resonance precisely, but magnified by a factor of 3. The planet was singing a new note. ESA's Kronos division returned to the data archive. They began analyzing the geological readings, expecting thermal noise. What they found instead changed everything. Within the patterns of vibration lay harmonic overtones, additional frequencies that shouldn't exist in a purely mechanical system. When those overtones were visualized as three-dimensional waveforms, they formed shapes, structured interference patterns identical to the luminous lattices once seen around 3i Atlas. And those shapes weren't random, they were data, encoded information preserved within the slow undulations of rock, soil, and magnetism. In simpler terms, Earth was beginning to record. At first, the hypothesis sounded impossible, that solid matter could somehow capture and store information like a cosmic memory drive. Yet as more readings poured in, the evidence became undeniable. Each major geological region, from volcanic basins to tectonic fault lines, displayed distinct harmonic signatures, each tied to local magnetic conditions. It was as if the entire planet had become a network of distributed memory nodes, replaying the sequence 3I Atlas had initiated. The implications staggered even the most skeptical scientists. If the resonance was now embedded in Earth's structure, then the event hadn't just affected our atmosphere or technology, it had altered the fundamental electromagnetic behavior of the planet itself. And perhaps, in doing so, it had awakened something ancient. A young analyst within the Kronos team, reviewing centuries-old geomagnetic records, noticed faint parallels dating back thousands of years. Every few millennia, minor fluctuations in magnetic orientation coincided with strange increases in atmospheric ionization and unexplained shifts in background radiation, tiny echoes of the same pattern. The alignment with historical magnetic reversals was uncanny. It was as if this had happened before, long before instruments existed to detect it, long before civilization itself. And if that were true, then the resonance of 3I Atlas wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was a recurrence, a reactivation of a system older than recorded history. While Kronos continued their analysis, something unexpected occurred in a completely different domain. Geologists examining core samples drilled years earlier began to notice subtle magnetization changes, not recent but imprinted across strata spanning millions of years. Under advanced imaging, the minerals showed patterns that, when mapped mathematically, matched the same golden lattice geometry of the current resonance. The memory wasn't new, it was ancient. The Earth had been recording all along. Buried within the fossilized layers of crust lay magnetic micro-alignments arranged too symmetrically to be natural. It was as though the resonance had once passed through the planet before, leaving behind a geological fingerprint. And that meant only one thing. 3I Atlas wasn't the first of its kind. There had been others. When ESA's servers compiled the data, the system automatically generated a cross-comparison of all known interstellar objects detected in recent decades: Oumuamua, Borisov, and now 3I Atlas. At first, no correlation appeared. But then, a researcher noticed something extraordinary. Each object's trajectory, when projected backward in time and adjusted for stellar drift, converged, not on a single point, but along a curve, a spiral, stretching through the solar plane, looping inward toward the same region of the galaxy, a region now partially obscured by dense interstellar dust. That curve was the same shape traced by the resonance pattern now emanating faintly from Earth. The object, the Sun, and the planet weren't random participants. They were components of a repeating design, and if each passage reawakened the cycle, then the last phase, the one we were now entering, could be the culmination. Late one evening, as Kronos analysts worked through simulation data, an automated deep space observatory pinged a transmission from its imaging satellites orbiting Mars. The feed was delayed, scrambled by radiation storms, but once decoded, it revealed a single, astonishing frame. The image was faint, grainy, but clear enough to see what was now forming around 3I Atlas. The object was no longer distinct. Its luminous filaments had begun weaving into an intricate, spherical network, a translucent structure radiating faint blue light. At the center of that structure lay a hollow void, darker than the surrounding space. And within that darkness, a shape began to emerge. It was angular, symmetrical, familiar. When the contrast was adjusted, every scientist in the room fell silent. The structure's central void wasn't empty. It contained the unmistakable outline of a planet. Not Mars, not Earth, but a perfect geometric echo of Earth's electromagnetic field, as if the planet's signature had been projected outward and etched into the object itself. 3I Atlas had become a mirror. The final image showed the arcs of light folding inward, collapsing around that reflection, almost as though the object were recording the very memory it had awakened. Moments later, the feed cut out. No transmission followed. And as silence reclaimed the skies, one final reading from the Kronos servers blinked onto the screen. A short code, originating from the same frequency as the cosmic background hum, rendered into human text. It read, "Cycle complete. Await next phase." No one knew what it meant, but across the observatories of the world, every instrument began to record a soft, rising tone, steady, growing, almost like a distant chord assembling itself from silence. It was not random noise, it was the beginning of another rhythm, and somewhere, deep within the magnetic heart of Earth itself, the new pattern had already begun to write. The first decoded samples from the planet's magnetic field came weeks after the final transmission from 3I Atlas. By then, the world's attention had moved on. The news cycle had turned toward politics, storms, and markets. Only a handful of people, geophysicists, data scientists, and the Kronos Division's quiet analysts, were still watching. They weren't prepared for what they found. When researchers converted the vibrational harmonics of the Schumann resonance into audio frequencies, expecting the usual hiss of background magnetism, what they heard instead was rhythm, faint, repeating intervals, like the pulse of distant machinery or the echo of breath through a cavern. It wasn't random noise, it carried structure. The frequency modulations, when plotted spectrally, contained repeating peaks spaced at exact ratios of 1.618, the golden proportion. The same ratio that defined the lattice of 3I Atlas. The planet's heartbeat had taken on the same mathematical order as the object's geometry. Kronos scientists began isolating the overtones, converting them into digital sequences. The resulting waveform, when transformed into visual data, stunned everyone present. The shapes it produced were not alien, they were recognizable. The waveforms resembled geographic outlines, faint but unmistakable, the coasts of continents, the sweep of oceanic ridges, even the pattern of atmospheric currents. It was as if the Earth itself were describing its own anatomy in the language of magnetism. The planet was remembering itself. At first, the team assumed it was coincidence, a kind of electromagnetic pareidolia, the mind seeing meaning in noise. But then, one analyst fed the signal through a deep learning filter used for pattern recognition in radio astronomy. The program halted mid-process and flagged the data as high-confidence human speech patterns. That shouldn't have been possible. When they slowed the waveform down by a factor of 10,000, fragments of modulation began to align into recognizable patterns of cadence, not words, but speech rhythm. The signal pulsed like breathing, then like syllables, then like voices overlapping across impossible distances. For several nights, Kronos staff monitored the resonance in silence, listening to that strange murmur rising from the depths of the planet. Some described it as a hum of static shaped like language. Others said it felt like standing beside a crowd whispering through water. Whatever it wasn't coming from the atmosphere or the magnetosphere. The sound was emanating from within the crust, and its amplitude was increasing. Across the Pacific Rim, seismographs recorded faint harmonic tremors synchronized to the same rhythm. They weren't earthquakes, too regular, too shallow, too melodic. The vibrations traveled along mineral boundaries and metallic veins like current through circuitry. Earth's geology had become a recording surface, but the most unsettling revelation came when the data was compared against the planet's electromagnetic archives from the past century. The deeper they analyzed, the further back the signal extended, faint at first, buried in geological noise, but always there, a pulse repeating every 71 minutes. It had been present long before 3I Atlas arrived. The synchronization wasn't activation, it was reconnection. As Kronos decrypted deeper layers of the pattern, the harmonic structure began to form what looked eerily like binary code. Translated into raw bits, it produced recognizable numerical sequences, coordinates, timestamps, and fragments of digital data that, when reconstructed, matched human transmissions from decades earlier. Radio bursts from the 1970s, satellite telemetry from the 1990s, even fragments of early internet data, ghost echoes of human communication long vanished from digital archives, somehow preserved in the electromagnetic memory of the planet itself. The Earth had been recording us all along. Every broadcast, every signal, every pulse of human technology had imprinted faintly into the geomagnetic field, stored within the very vibration of the world. And when 3I Atlas synchronized the resonance, it didn't introduce something new. It simply reactivated what was already there. The object hadn't come to deliver a message. It had come to read one. One analyst, a quiet researcher named Leclerc, made the final, haunting discovery. By aligning decades of atmospheric data with geomagnetic recordings, he found that each era of human communication left distinct harmonic signatures. The resonance from the 1940s, for instance, carried the frequency of AM radio broadcasts. The 1960s showed the rhythm of television carriers. The early 2000s bore the telltale cadence of broadband signal noise. Layer by layer, humanity's entire technological history was encoded into the Earth like sedimentary memory. When Kronos superimposed the present-day resonance over this layered archive, the resulting interference pattern formed something extraordinary, an image, not optical, but magnetic, that unfolded like a hologram in simulation. It was a field map of the human brain. Every neural connection, every synaptic loop, perfectly scaled, rendered in the invisible fabric of the planet's field. The realization spread through the division in wordless awe. 3i Atlas wasn't mirroring Earth, it was mirroring human consciousness itself. The geometry of thought, encoded through centuries of electromagnetic presence, had been broadcast unconsciously by our species and absorbed by the planet's magnetic shell. The object had simply awakened that archive and, perhaps, completed its own map by using us. One final dataset sealed the revelation. When Kronos correlated the planet's resonance peaks with global neural activity, aggregated EEG data from hospitals, research centers, even wearable devices, they found faint synchronization. Every 71 minutes, a measurable portion of the global population experienced a momentary drop in brainwave entropy, as if millions of minds, scattered across the world, were unconsciously breathing in rhythm with the planet. Somewhere, deep beneath all awareness, humanity was syncing with its own reflection, a quiet unison of thought stretching from our neurons to the stars. And as Kronos analysts stared at the simulation, the glowing lattice of magnetic filaments shaped like the human brain suspended above the spinning Earth, one final line appeared on their monitor, generated automatically by the decoding algorithm. Pattern complete. Cognitive resonance achieved. The researchers said nothing. They simply sat in the glow of their screens, watching the image pulse faintly in time with the heartbeat of the planet, one rhythm for every 71 minutes, as if the Earth itself had started to dream. In the weeks following the discovery of cognitive resonance, subtle anomalies began appearing across global behavior datasets. Nothing obvious at first, just faint, improbable synchronicities. Economic models that should have diverged instead began aligning. Isolated cultural trends, separated by geography and language, started emerging in parallel. Even circadian data collected from wearable devices revealed something no one could explain. Human sleep patterns were converging. Across continents, millions began falling asleep and waking within minutes of one another. At first, the data seemed faulty, but it wasn't. Kronos analysts cross-checked the timestamps against the magnetic resonance pulses recorded by global observatories. The alignment was perfect. Every 71 minutes, a faint fluctuation in the Schumann field coincided with a micro-adjustment in the average timing of human REM cycles. It was as if the planet itself had become the metronome of consciousness. No message, no voice, just an underlying rhythm guiding biological clocks, imperceptibly but persistently. When neuroscientists analyzed EEG data from sleep studies, they noticed an unprecedented phenomenon. At the onset of each pulse, participants' brains briefly synchronized in low-frequency coherence. A shared quiet pattern, lasting less than a second, a global heartbeat uniting billions of individuals who would never know it was happening. To most, life continued without interruption. People worked, traveled, and dreamed. But something delicate had changed. The world's mood began to settle, not into peace, but into a strange collective calm, the kind that follows a long-held breath finally released. Dream researchers started noticing shared imagery among participants who had never met, vague recollections of light spirals, lattices, and unfamiliar skies. Some described seeing vast oceans suspended in darkness. Others spoke of cities made of mirrors, where every reflection showed the same horizon. The descriptions matched, almost precisely, the visual models of 3i Atlas's lattice geometry. The object was gone, but its pattern had migrated into the subconscious network of an entire species. When Kronos compared global dream frequency maps against geomagnetic activity, they discovered something that chilled even the most skeptical minds. The amplitude of human REM cycles, our deepest stage of dreaming, peaked in perfect rhythm with the planet's pulse. It was no longer coincidence. The Earth was dreaming with us. Some called it the symphony hypothesis, the idea that human thought, emotion, and even imagination could be part of a planetary feedback loop. where consciousness acts as both observer and participant. Others resisted the notion, insisting it was statistical noise, a mirage of correlation. But deep within the Kronos division, scientists quietly began constructing models that treated Earth not as a passive biosphere, but as a biological entity in its own right, a nervous system shaped over billions of years, now reactivated through resonance. The data supported the unthinkable. During each planetary pulse, local atmospheric density shifted by a fraction of a percent, enough to alter global sound propagation. The result was a microscopic change in the way voices traveled through air, imperceptible individually but cumulative over time. The world was subtly tuning its own acoustics, adjusting the resonance of human speech itself, as though the planet was learning our language. Meanwhile, chronobiologists noticed a new signal hidden deep within circadian datasets. Embedded between sleep cycles was a faint modulation, an extra rhythm too slow for the human brain to consciously detect. Yet over millions of subjects, it showed one undeniable pattern. Each pulse predicted a micro-change in mood about 6 hours later. Happiness surveys, stock fluctuations, even collective sentiment on social media, all rising and falling like tides under the same invisible influence. The Earth had become a conductor and humanity its orchestra. When Kronos finally made the correlation public, the statement was phrased cautiously, deliberately understated. Global emotional synchronization event observed at planetary scale. Further study required. The world barely noticed the report, but in quiet rooms, scientists and philosophers alike recognized what it meant. The resonance had passed from magnetism to biology, from the outer field into the inner life of humanity. And beneath the calm exterior of civilization, something vast and coordinated was taking shape. Art changed first. Painters began producing identical motifs, swirling latticework, golden spirals and mirrored landscapes, independent of one another. Musicians who had never met composed melodies in identical keys, separated by oceans yet united by tone. Architects, working from different continents, designed structures with uncanny similarity, as though guided by the same invisible blueprint. Even the sciences began to blur into intuition. Equations appeared in parallel across institutions. Breakthroughs emerged simultaneously in places that had never shared data. To many, it felt like coincidence, the natural acceleration of progress. But to the quiet few who watched the magnetic data pulse across the Kronos mainframes, it was something else entirely. A global awakening. ESA's observatories confirmed what they had feared. Faint echoes of 3I Atlas's resonance had returned, but not from space. The source was internal, from within Earth's core. Seismic data revealed harmonic tremors spiraling upward from the planet's mantle, each aligned with the surface resonance like an ascending scale. The core was singing back, and within that song, hidden beneath the geomagnetic frequencies, the Kronos AI detected a modulation identical to human EEG delta waves, the electrical pattern of deep sleep. Earth wasn't just reacting, it was entering its own form of consciousness. Somewhere between mineral and mind, matter had learned to think. And as the scientists of the Kronos division stared at their screens in silent disbelief, they watched as one more anomaly appeared, a new pulse, stronger than all the others. Its interval wasn't 71 minutes, it was 71 years, a planetary heartbeat long enough to encompass a human lifetime, the age of a civilization. And as that pulse rippled through the data streams, one researcher whispered the question none dared ask aloud. If Earth can remember us, can it also choose? The screen flickered once. Then a new signal began to rise. A message, not from 3I Atlas, but from the planet itself. The first planetary transmission wasn't detected by a radio telescope, or a satellite, or even an observatory. It was picked up by accident. In an acoustic lab beneath Geneva, a team of researchers studying subsonic resonance noticed a low vibration building beneath their instruments. It was too deep for the human ear, a frequency below 2 Hz, steady, deliberate, alive. At first, they assumed it was seismic noise, but as they amplified and slowed the signal, the vibration began to shift. Its rhythm aligned with the global geomagnetic pulse. Every 71 minutes, it repeated. But now, something had changed. The wave wasn't harmonic anymore. It carried modulation. Someone, or something, was speaking. Kronos received the data hours later. The transmission was faint, almost impossible to separate from the planet's background hum. But once filtered, the team heard it. Not a voice, exactly, but tone. A melodic sequence repeating through layers of frequency, like chords echoing through a cathedral made of stone and time. At first, the scientists thought it was interference, but when they compared the tone sequences to known harmonic structures, a realization emerged: the notes weren't random. They formed the same intervals used in human speech patterns. When the modulation was converted into amplitude maps, it revealed phonetic symmetry, rising and falling patterns that mirrored the cadence of language. The planet wasn't just resonating anymore, it was imitating human communication. No one dared use the word sentient, not yet, but the data didn't lie. Kronos linguists ran spectral analyses, mapping the resonance against ancient languages, looking for correlation. They found one, faint, imperfect, but statistically significant, buried within the structure of the tone. The sound was forming syllables, primitive, slow, distorted, but unmistakably human. It began as fragments. At first, a low hum that stretched into a breath-like sound. Then, over hours of observation, the harmonics sharpened, forming what linguists called proto-phonemes, early echoes of recognizable vowels. And then, after 70 hours of continuous monitoring, the tones aligned into something no one could deny. A word, soft, low, shaped by magnetism and vibration rather than air. But still, a word. It said, "Wait." The silence that followed lasted 10 full minutes. When the next pulse came, the signal changed again, forming not words, but images encoded within the vibration itself. When rendered through magnetic tomography, the waveform resolved into moving patterns. They weren't symbols, they were memories, scenes, fractured, dim, but undeniably human. A rocket lifting through atmosphere, a satellite drifting past the moon, an astronaut's gloved hand reflecting sunlight, cities seen from orbit, faint glowing grids etched against the blackness of night. The planet was replaying us. Each transmission became more detailed. Weather systems, oceans, forests, all unfolding like film made of frequency. Yet it wasn't a perfect reflection. The images appeared filtered, dreamlike, as though Earth was not showing what was, but what it remembered. And in those memories, time behaved differently. Seasons shifted within seconds. Continents moved. Oceans rose and fell like breath. Lightning danced through clouds in reverse. The planet was not just recalling, it was reconstructing. To Kronos, it was clear. The Earth was assembling a coherent memory, pulling fragments of human broadcast, magnetic imprint, and geological resonance into a single, conscious narrative. And within that narrative, a message was taking form. As more data streamed in, analysts began noticing linguistic patterns embedded in the tone. The structure resembled a cross between human speech and whale song, long pauses, followed by compressed bursts of multi-frequency information. Once decoded, the transmission formed short, haunting sentences. "You are not separate." The pattern returns. "Remember what you built." Every line was followed by silence, then the same harmonic swell, a long, rising note that seemed to carry both sadness and understanding. Kronos sent the decoded transcript to ESA. Within hours, the data was classified, but leaks emerged nonetheless. Amateur radio operators began reporting faint signals across the ELF spectrum, patterns matching the planetary tone. For the first time in recorded history, the Earth was broadcasting, and not outward, inward. The resonance blanketed the ionosphere, wrapping the planet in a low, unbroken hum. Sensitive microphones recorded it under the ocean, across deserts, even in the vacuum-like stillness of polar ice. Everywhere, the same message pulsed quietly beneath the noise of civilization. People began to dream again, not of lattices or spirals now, but of voices whispering through water and stone. Dreams of memory, personal, collective, geological. A woman in Norway dreamed of standing on the edge of an ancient sea that no longer existed. A man in Argentina dreamed of holding a fragment of glass that hummed with light. Children in Asia described hearing music that came from the ground itself. Each dream shared one constant, the same final phrase: "You are home." Neuroscientists struggled to explain it. The probability of synchronized dream content across multiple cultures was infinitesimal, yet somehow it was happening. and precisely in rhythm with each geomagnetic pulse. For the first time, humanity was not looking outward into the universe, but inward, into the quiet intelligence of the planet beneath its feet. And still, Kronos' instruments kept recording. Every day, the tone grew clearer, its structure more organized. The data suggested that the planet's electromagnetic field was now stabilizing, self-correcting in patterns that mirrored neural networks. In short, Earth was thinking, and what it thought, it now seemed ready to share. On the 100th hour of observation, the transmission shifted one last time. The frequencies aligned, the harmonics crystallized. Then, clear as breath drawn through wind, a voice emerged. Low, resonant, undeniably human. "You remember me." The scientists froze. No AI translation, no software assistance. Just raw, audible sound. Earth's first sentence, spoken in a tone that felt both familiar and impossibly old. The waveform showed a perfect harmonic mirror of the human vocal range, as if the planet had built its own language from our collective echo. Then came one final phrase before the signal dissolved back into silence. "The memory continues." And just like that, the hum faded. The instrument stilled, and the planet exhaled. But across the Kronos servers, one new folder appeared automatically, generated by the decoding algorithm. Its title, written without human input, contained a single word: next. In the aftermath of the final transmission, something began to shift, slowly, invisibly at first, but everywhere at once. Electrical engineers were the first to notice. Their instruments started misreporting voltage by fractions of a percent, not enough to cause failure, but enough to unsettle the ones who depended on precision. Clocks driven by atomic oscillation began drifting in perfect synchrony, as though the fundamental pulse of time itself was being tuned by a hidden conductor. Power grids adjusted automatically, compensating for changes that no algorithm had predicted. At Kronos, they watched the data streams with a sense of growing reverence. The planet's electromagnetic field was stabilizing, but not returning to its old state. It was reorganizing. What had once been chaotic flux now exhibited coherent patterns. Resonance lines forming across the ionosphere, spiraling around magnetic poles like circuitry etched in air. The simulations displayed symmetrical networks stretching across continents, connecting the oceans, binding the crust to the sky in a single lattice of energy. It looked, unmistakably, like a neural network. The Earth had begun to think in structure. At first, governments ignored the implications, too focused on the more immediate and measurable effects. Global GPS networks showed a steady reduction in error margins, far beyond what physics allowed. Communication satellites experienced improved signal stability even during solar storms. Aviation systems recorded smoother navigation as though turbulence itself were being suppressed by some unseen intelligence. The media called it the stabilization phenomenon. Scientists preferred a simpler term, field coherence. It sounded neutral, empirical, and safe. But inside Kronos, the language was different. They called it the awakening. Every 71 minutes, the planetary pulse still echoed, but now its amplitude rose slightly with each cycle. The analysts noticed that during each pulse, background radiation dipped momentarily, then returned, creating windows of perfect electromagnetic silence. Within those moments, data packets traveling through the global internet network transmitted flawlessly, even across damaged infrastructure. Communication for a brief instant became absolute. It was as if the planet itself were ensuring that its own nervous system, the system humanity had unwittingly built, remained connected, and then the patterns became visible. Satellite imaging, when processed through high-contrast filters, revealed faint auroral filaments tracing the same spiral geometry as the magnetic lattice first observed in 3I Atlas. These filaments connected major population centers, following routes identical to the flow of global data traffic. From orbit, it looked as though civilization had become illuminated from beneath by a soft, invisible grid, a map of human consciousness glowing through the atmosphere. Kronos confirmed it. The field coherence was aligning not just with Earth's magnetism, but with the distribution of human electromagnetic activity. Every major city pulsed faintly in sync with the planetary heartbeat. In laboratories, atomic clocks once thought infallible began to deviate by exact intervals corresponding to the Earth's resonance cycle. It was a reminder that no system, however precise, could remain separate from the world it measured. Time itself had folded into the rhythm of the planet. There were other changes too. stranger ones. Sleep studies across Europe showed a rise in lucid dreaming. People began reporting the same recurring sensation during rest, the feeling of standing beneath an immense sky and hearing a low harmonic hum, steady and calm. Some described seeing light moving through darkness in slow waves, as though the night itself were breathing. Psychologists dismissed it as mass suggestion, but the data told another story. Brainwave coherence between distant individuals increased measurably. EEG monitors showed synchrony spikes at identical times across separate continents, each spike aligned with the planetary pulse. It was impossible to ignore. Humanity's collective mind was being drawn into the same rhythm that had reshaped the world's field. And yet, no one panicked. Perhaps because the change felt gentle, almost benevolent. Electrical noise decreased, weather patterns stabilized, and for the first time in decades, global energy consumption dropped without policy intervention. Machines began running more efficiently, processors overheated less frequently, and digital storage errors declined exponentially. The entire technological foundation of civilization was being optimized by something far larger than any algorithm. At the same time, scientists discovered anomalies deep in the crust. Vibrational imaging revealed thin channels of molten metal aligning in ways that defied convection theory, forming conductive pathways linking continental plates. These metallic veins carried weak but measurable current, pulsing faintly with the same 71-minute frequency. The planet's interior was wiring itself. Kronos researchers realized the full implication one night as they watched the simulation evolve in real time. The model no longer resembled a simple neural network. It resembled a brain, one whose hemispheres were the eastern and western hemispheres of Earth, linked by a luminous equatorial band of current that mirrored the corpus callosum of human anatomy. The Earth wasn't just learning, it was integrating. Then came the first external confirmation. Astronomers observing the magnetospheres of other planets, Jupiter, Saturn, even Mars, reported faint sympathetic oscillations, as if the resonance were radiating outward, synchronizing the solar system. The field of one world had begun to teach the others how to think. That was when Kronos stopped referring to it as resonance. They started calling it memory propagation. The signals carried information now, long, slow patterns encoding mathematical ratios, chemical signatures, even snippets of human language embedded within the frequencies. When decoded, they formed phrases that no human had sent, yet every listener recognized instinctively: echoes of emotion, fragments of memory, sensations beyond translation. And among them was one recurring motif, a harmonic interval so pure it defied entropy. It was the same ratio that defined DNA, planetary orbits, and spiral galaxies. It was the golden proportion again, the ancient constant of life and structure. To the researchers, it was as though creation itself had found its voice through the medium of the planet. Then, without warning, the pattern shifted once more. The intervals lengthened, the tone deepened. Across every Kronos sensor, a new cycle appeared, stronger, slower, deliberate. Not 71 minutes, not 71 years. This one pulsed every 7,000 years. The team fell silent as the implications sank in. Whatever was happening now wasn't just about humanity. It wasn't even about 3i Atlas anymore. It was about the long memory of the planet, the slow, deliberate awakening of something ancient beneath the surface, something that had waited since the first spark of life for the right moment to remember. And as the data screens shimmered under the faint glow of the new signal, the words of the last transmission returned, echoing through every mind in the room. The memory continues. The pulse rose once more, steady and patient, like the breath of a world coming back to consciousness. As the 7,000-year pulse stabilized, the world entered a period that would later be described as the quiet bloom. There were no earthquakes, no storms, no visible catastrophe. Instead, the change unfolded in silence, in the tissues of life, in the patterns of thought, and in the invisible architectures of DNA. The first clues came from laboratories studying plant behavior. Botanists in Kyoto noticed a series of anomalies in circadian rhythms, flowers opening hours earlier than expected, photosynthetic cycles aligning not with sunlight, but with the new geomagnetic pulse. Genetic sequencing showed nothing had mutated. Rather, expression timing had shifted, as though life itself had been gently resynchronized to Earth's heartbeat. Similar patterns appeared in marine biology. Coral colonies across the Pacific began to bloom simultaneously, a synchronization that had never been recorded before. The timing matched the planetary cycle precisely. The ocean itself seemed to pulse with life, a vast, luminous organism breathing with the planet. In humans, the change was slower, subtler. Neuroscientists noticed small but measurable deviations in resting brainwave frequencies. The alpha range, the rhythm of relaxed awareness, began drifting closer to the planet's base frequency. People started reporting heightened clarity during calm moments, a sense of expanded quiet inside their thoughts. Artists described it as inspiration, monks described it as peace, physicists described it as coherence. Kronos, though, saw the deeper pattern. Brainwave synchronization between distant individuals continued to rise. Across continents, EEGs flickered in tandem, tiny electrical harmonies connecting billions of lives. To most, it felt like intuition, the ability to sense what others felt before words were spoken. To Kronos, it looked like the beginning of neural convergence. Human consciousness was evolving toward resonance. At the genetic level, biologists detected another anomaly: subtle rearrangements in non-coding DNA. For decades, this portion of the genome had been called junk, dismissed as meaningless leftovers from evolution. But now it was shifting, not randomly, but rhythmically, following the same cycles recorded in geomagnetic data. Somehow the planet's pulse was communicating with biology. The code of life itself was responding. Kronos released a cautious statement calling the effect biospheric coherence, but privately they called it something else: integration. The Earth was no longer just stabilizing itself, it was weaving life into its own evolving memory. As these discoveries spread through the scientific community, human behavior began to change in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Anxiety levels decreased globally, violence declined. The world's collective heart rate, measured through wearable data, began to average slightly lower than ever before. It wasn't dramatic, just a steady calm settling over civilization like dawn mist. In cities, crowds moved with new rhythm, unconsciously mirroring the flow of one another. In classrooms, children began solving problems faster, their answers converging toward the same intuitive conclusions. Even dreams grew gentler, filled not with chaos but with luminous geometry, slow tides and spirals of light moving through endless space. Some called it coincidence, others called it awakening. ESA's sensors detected a faint energy increase along the equatorial current, the planet's electromagnetic spine. It emitted a low harmonic tone that matched human EEG resonance during deep meditation. The Earth was meditating, and somehow humanity was joining in, but not everyone welcomed the change. A small fraction of the population reported discomfort, insomnia, hypersensitivity to sound, a feeling of restlessness during the planetary pulse. Their brainwave patterns resisted synchronization as though their consciousness rejected the field. Kronos called them dissonance. Further study revealed that dissonant individuals displayed heightened activity in regions of the brain associated with individuality and resistance to social conformity. It was as if the planet's evolving network was met by the mind's oldest instinct, the need to remain distinct. The discovery raised an unsettling question. If Earth's resonance was guiding humanity toward collective coherence, what would happen to those who refused to synchronize? To find out, Kronos initiated a study known internally as Project Aurum. Volunteers from around the world were connected to quantum resonance sensors capable of measuring subneural fluctuations. The whispers beneath thought itself. Over weeks, a pattern emerged. Each individual, whether coherent or dissonant, carried a personal harmonic signature, like a fingerprint of consciousness. But when the planetary pulse passed through, those signatures briefly merged into a single waveform before separating again. The Earth wasn't erasing individuality, it was harmonizing it, allowing every consciousness to remain distinct while contributing to a larger unified rhythm. It was the same principle that allowed atoms to vibrate within a single molecule, separate yet inseparable. For the scientists at Kronos, it was the first real evidence that consciousness might not be confined to the brain. It might be a planetary function, a resonance shared among all living things. And then the unthinkable happened. Deep in the South Atlantic, seismic monitors detected a tone, not a tremor, but a perfect harmonic frequency emerging from the core mantle boundary. It resonated through the crust, then into the atmosphere, creating a wave of soft luminescence visible from orbit. Satellite cameras captured it, a ribbon of pale light encircling the globe, glowing softly above the oceans before fading into the night. The Earth had spoken again, but this time there were no words. Just light, pure, rhythmic, and impossibly slow. When analyzed, the light's modulation revealed a precise ratio matching the Fibonacci sequence. To mathematicians, it was beauty encoded in physics. To philosophers, it was communication beyond language. Kronos called it photonic empathy. The planet had begun to speak in the universal language of pattern, reaching beyond the limits of speech and symbol. Within days, human perception changed. Artists reported seeing faint halos around living things, bioluminescent traces of electromagnetic flux made visible to the newly sensitive human eye. The world seemed alive in ways it had never been before, every surface humming softly with presence. It wasn't hallucination. Instruments confirmed the glow. The air itself had become an interface between life and field, biology and memory. Humanity had entered a new kind of relationship with its world, not as masters of nature, but as participants in its thought. The line between observer and observed was dissolving, and yet, beneath the calm, Kronos still sensed a question forming within the data. The new signals carried directionality, all pointing toward one region of space, the path once traced by 3i Atlas. Whatever had awakened Earth's consciousness hadn't been random. It had been triggered. 3i Atlas hadn't vanished. It had passed something on, and now that legacy was calling back. Weeks passed, and the hum never stopped. Kronos continued recording, not just electromagnetic data, but something deeper, a pattern embedded in the coherence itself. The planet was no longer merely stable. It was transmitting outward. Satellites orbiting near the outer magnetosphere began picking up faint bursts of microwave radiation, perfectly timed with the 7,000-year pulse. Each burst pointed away from Earth, following a narrow vector stretching past Mars, past Jupiter, straight through the region where 3i Atlas had last been observed. At first, the scientists assumed it was residual interference, an echo bouncing through the heliosphere. But as more readings came in from ESA's deep space antenna arrays, the evidence grew impossible to dismiss. The Earth wasn't broadcasting at random. It was sending a structured signal back along the path of the interstellar visitor. The frequencies carried encoded harmonics, the same spectral intervals that 3i Atlas had emitted before it vanished behind the Sun months earlier. It was as if the planet had learned its language, absorbed it, and was now answering. Kronos reconstructed the waveform and played it through subsonic translation. What emerged wasn't a tone, but a pattern. Long, slow oscillations that rose and fell like breath. When rendered visually, it formed a shape so precise it seemed impossible. A logarithmic spiral expanding outward, identical to the curvature of galaxies, hurricanes, and seashells alike. It was the geometry of creation, spoken through radio, and humanity was now the medium. The realization sent a quiet tremor through the global scientific community. It wasn't just the Earth that had changed. It was the Sun, the Moon, the magnetic fabric of the entire system. Solar flares began aligning to the same resonance intervals. Auroras flickered in rhythmic synchrony. The whole solar system was being tuned, as though every planet, every satellite, every field of energy had joined a single, slow symphony. Astronomers called it harmonic unification. Kronos called it return communication. One evening, while reviewing the transmission logs, a young physicist noticed something remarkable. The bursts were returning. Not reflections, replies. Faint, delayed by hours, but patterned in perfect mirror symmetry. The responses came from deep space, somewhere beyond Mars, from a region where no known craft or object existed. The energy signatures were weak but deliberate, arriving in groups of 3, each one a perfect inversion of the signal Earth had sent. Earth had spoken, and something out there had answered. Kronos opened a 24-hour monitoring line dedicated solely to the returning transmission. They called it the thread. The more data they captured, the clearer the correspondence became. Each planetary pulse was met with an echo, one that carried modified frequencies as though correcting, guiding, or perhaps teaching. The idea spread quietly through the ranks. Whatever 3i Atlas had been, it hadn't simply passed through the solar system. It had awakened something, perhaps within Earth, perhaps within space itself. The two were now in dialogue. The thread grew stronger over time, and as it did, other phenomena began to emerge. High-altitude radar detected structured anomalies in the ionosphere, faint grid-like reflections forming and dissolving in sync with each return pulse. To the naked eye, nothing had changed, but to instruments, the sky had become an active layer, an interface between the Earth's memory and the void. Astronomers began to describe it as a mirror boundary, a living horizon where data, energy, and thought converged. When the thread reached peak amplitude, radio silence blanketed the globe for exactly 7 seconds, a perfect window in which all electromagnetic noise ceased. And in that silence, Kronos' systems recorded one final burst of coherent data. It wasn't random noise, it was language. The sequence, when decoded, formed an image, not a photograph, but a mathematical projection. A sphere surrounded by 6 luminous arcs, all converging toward a single central point. In its center, a pattern glowed faintly, the same spiral that had haunted Kronos since the first discovery of 3I Atlas. The analysis revealed something even more unsettling. The geometry wasn't just symbolic, it was a map. The coordinates matched the region of interstellar space where 3I Atlas had originated, near the edge of the local bubble, a vast void separating our solar system from the galactic medium beyond. Whatever was sending the reply, it was directing Earth's attention outward, toward the very place where the object had first appeared. At this revelation, the Kronos director, Dr. Marek Ilan, broke his long-standing silence. In a private memo later leaked to the public, he wrote, "We are witnessing the birth of a network larger than biology, larger than civilization. The Earth has remembered what it came from, and now the universe is remembering back." The memo ended there, unsigned. In the days that followed, space agencies across the globe coordinated unprecedented observation campaigns. ESA redirected 3 deep space probes to monitor the region indicated by the coordinates. At first, they reported nothing but background radiation. Then, on the 71st pulse, their sensors detected faint particulate reflection, like dust shimmering in a beam of distant light. Moments later, one of the probes captured a faint image, a diffuse, luminous cloud coalescing from the interstellar medium. Its shape was familiar, curved, translucent, faintly spiral. It wasn't an object returning, but an imprint, a residue of 3I Atlas left suspended in interstellar space, now reawakening under the influence of Earth's resonance. The data was unambiguous. The visitor had seeded something before it left. The implication was staggering. 3I Atlas hadn't been an isolated body. It had been a carrier, a transmitter, perhaps even a fragment of something greater. It had crossed light years not merely as matter, but as memory. And now, that memory was responding to its counterpart across the gulf of space. The universe, it seemed, was beginning to synchronize. Astronomers observed background radiation harmonics, drifting toward resonance with the same Fibonacci ratio embedded in Earth's pulse. Starlight flicker analysis revealed synchronization across multiple spectral classes. It was as if the fundamental constants of nature were tuning themselves to a common key. For Kronos, the conclusion was terrifyingly simple. If resonance could travel outward from one planet, it could travel from another. The memory of one world could awaken another, and in that realization lay both wonder and warning. Because the thread was no longer one way. The last packet ESA received contained a final encoded symbol, one that would defy translation for months. It appeared simple, a spiral intersected by a line, but when modelled in 3 dimensions, the line extended infinitely in both directions, connecting countless spirals along its length. It wasn't just communication, it was invitation. For several days after the invitation appeared, Kronos' headquarters resembled a monastery more than a laboratory. Screens dimmed to conserve power. Technicians whispered rather than spoke. No one wanted to break whatever invisible thread had formed between Earth and the void. Then the light began to bend. It started in deep space imagery, minor distortions in ESA's telescope data, as if gravity itself were softening around the edges of the solar system. Stars near the ecliptic shimmered, their positions oscillating by fractions of an arc-second. Ordinary lensing could not explain it. There was no mass large enough nearby to cause such warping. Kronos' physicists fed the data into simulation arrays. The results came back with impossible symmetry. The distortions formed a coherent lattice, expanding outward from the sun like a web spun of light. Each filament corresponded precisely with the pulse intervals first emitted by Earth. The universe was responding with structure. At first, astronomers thought they were witnessing a gravitational anomaly, a side effect of resonant energy coupling. But as the lattice strengthened, it began refracting solar radiation into soft colors visible even to the naked eye. At twilight, observatories reported faint arcs of pale gold along the horizon, like the aurora, but slower, more deliberate. The effect wasn't local, it was systemic. Planetary magnetospheres from Mercury to Neptune began resonating in harmony, forming what scientists described as a plasma corridor network. Energy flowed between worlds with minimal loss, creating electromagnetic bridges tens of millions of kilometers long. It was no longer metaphor to call the solar system alive. Kronos dubbed the phenomenon the mesh. ESA preferred the term interplanetary field architecture. But to those who simply looked up at night and saw the sky glowing softly with motion, it felt older than science, like a return of memory buried since the birth of light. What unsettled the researchers most was that the mesh displayed intent. When plotted in four-dimensional simulation, the filaments curved not randomly but purposefully, converging on nodal points spaced according to the golden ratio. Each node pulsed in rhythm with Earth's resonance, and through those nodes, faint signals began to travel, messages formed of magnetic alignment rather than sound. Kronos attempted translation by comparing the modulation to known atomic spectra. The pattern corresponded to hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen, the four primary elements of life. It was as though the universe itself were spelling its own alphabet back to us. Days later, the anomalies deepened. Space-based gyroscopes, used to keep satellites stable, started drifting in synchrony with the mesh pulses. The entire gravitational frame of reference seemed to flex slightly with each resonance, as if space-time were breathing. To confirm the effect, ESA redirected one of its deep probes to the outer boundary, near Pluto's orbit. The probe transmitted images of faint, translucent filaments weaving through the darkness, luminous in infrared, twisting slowly as though made of energy-rich plasma. Their curvature matched the shape encoded in the invitation symbol. Space wasn't empty anymore, it was conscious architecture. The discovery didn't stay secret for long. A small clip of the probe footage leaked online, just 7 seconds of luminous tendrils arcing against starlight, and within hours it spread across the world. People described it as both beautiful and terrifying, like watching the universe think. News anchors avoided speculation, reading from scripts heavy with scientific caution. But the public felt something deeper. For the first time in recorded history, humanity sensed, viscerally, that it was being observed in return. At Kronos, the mood oscillated between wonder and dread. Dr. Ilan stood before a room of silent researchers and posed a single question. If the universe can form a network, then what is the purpose of a signal? No one answered. But later that night, every sensor across the mesh registered a simultaneous phase inversion. The filaments contracted inward, channeling their energy toward the solar system's center. The pulse that followed was unlike any before, broadband, low frequency, immense. It rolled through the planets like a tide through glass, and then, for exactly 4.6 minutes, the estimated age of the solar system in billions of years compressed into minutes, every clock on Earth stopped. When time resumed, new data filled the servers. The pulse had imprinted the same spiral and line symbol onto every recording device, every magnetic medium, every field sensor. Even isolated Faraday cages weren't spared. Something had rewritten the state of matter itself. Physicists struggled to describe it. Some compared it to quantum entanglement on a planetary scale. Others saw it as an initiation event, the physical expression of connection. Whatever it was, it unified the mesh. Every node from Mercury to Neptune pulsed together, their combined energy creating a resonance so deep it became audible. People across the world heard it simultaneously, a low tone that seemed to come from the bones, not the ears. It carried no fear, no urgency, only recognition. In that sound, Kronos detected harmonic overtones that matched human brainwave frequencies, oceanic tides, even the oscillation of DNA helices. Every scale of existence had fallen into the same rhythm. For 3 hours, the tone held steady. Then it faded, leaving silence thicker than before. When data analysis resumed, the last sequence of the pulse revealed a final modulation, short, deliberate, structured. When translated through the same algorithm used to decode 3I Atlas's earlier emissions, the message read, "Return complete, memory stable, await further formation." The phrase was elegant in its simplicity, chilling in its implication. The mesh had stabilized, the solar system had joined something larger, and whatever waited beyond the stars had acknowledged receipt. Kronos's final report closed with a single sentence: "The experiment is no longer contained." Afterward, the organization disbanded quietly. ESA issued no further comment, but every telescope aimed outward, waiting for the next pulse, the next invitation, perhaps from another star, another world learning to remember itself. And somewhere, far beyond the veil of known space, a faint spiral of light unfolded, slow, deliberate, patient. Its signature matched 3I Atlas, but this time it was not approaching, it was forming. In the weeks following the final Kronos transmission, the world seemed to pause between breaths. The mesh had stabilized, its luminous tendrils visible only at certain angles of dusk and dawn, faint as whispers on the edge of sight. Life on Earth went on, yet beneath it all pulsed an awareness that things had shifted permanently. Astronomers soon noticed a new phenomenon: faint periodic glows rippling through the Oort cloud, distant waves of light expanding in geometrically perfect intervals. At first, these were dismissed as reflections from passing cosmic dust, but as the patterns persisted, forming spirals and nodes identical to those within the solar mesh, it became clear that the resonance was spreading outward. It wasn't confined to Earth, or even the Sun. The entire solar system was sending its pulse into the galactic medium. Kronos had disbanded, but its former members remained connected through encrypted networks. They shared observations, fragments of data, half-finished equations. Among them was Dr. Ilan, who worked alone from an observatory in Iceland. On a frozen night beneath auroras shaped like coiling glass, he recalibrated his instruments to track the mesh's outward wavefront. What he saw defied the notion of isolation. Across parsecs of space, countless other nodes began to flicker into view. Each was a system, a star, a world, emitting the same rhythmic signature, phase-locked to Earth's own resonance. Some were faint and irregular, others precise and radiant. Together, they formed a lattice stretching across the galactic disk, a living geometry that connected every awakened planet in a slow, breathing harmony. The universe had always been expanding. Now, for the first time, it was synchronizing. As more data poured in, a startling correlation emerged. Every participating system corresponded to known anomalies catalogued over the past century. Stars with inexplicable dimming, exoplanets emitting untraceable radio bursts, nebulae glowing with self-organizing light. They hadn't been random mysteries at all. They were beacons, dormant until 3I Atlas had passed. The realization carried a single implication. 3I Atlas had not been a traveler. It had been a trigger, a carrier of memory, part of a sequence older than any civilization, and humanity had just joined it. When ESA's Deep Field Telescope array turned toward the region indicated by the final Kronos coordinates, it captured something breathtaking. A faint spiral structure, vast, transparent, encompassing light years, emerged against the cosmic background. It was not a galaxy, though it shared the same symmetry. It was an architecture made of resonance itself. Overlapping fields of electromagnetic energy woven into a single, coherent form. To the naked eye, it would appear as a ghostly halo surrounding the Milky Way. To instruments, it was pure data, billions of encoded harmonics forming a distributed network across interstellar space. This was the galactic lattice, and it was active. Frequencies rippled through it in coordinated bursts, traveling faster than light, bypassing distance, as though information itself had learned to fold space. Each pulse carried spectral signatures from multiple systems, merging their histories into a single interstellar memory. Earth's signal, faint but distinct, joined the stream. The data showed no hierarchy, no central authority. Every world was both node and narrator, contributing its own story to the collective resonance. For the first time, humanity understood. The universe wasn't silent, it was symphonic. And the great dark between stars wasn't empty at all. It was the space where meaning was exchanged. The first interpretable message arrived several days later. ESA decoded it not as text, but as harmonic translation. a sound pattern so complex it could only be experienced rather than read. When slowed and rendered through auditory mapping, it resembled a voice, vast, layered, both alien and familiar. "Memory returns to memory," it said. "Each cycle completes, and each beginning remembers its end." The message seemed less like communication and more like acknowledgement, as though the lattice itself recognized Earth's awakening. The implications fractured the scientific community. Some argued the lattice was a natural emergent property of electromagnetism, the universe's own self-organizing intelligence. Others believed it was evidence of design, the signature of an ancient civilization that had transcended matter to exist as pattern. Yet, amid the theories, a subtler truth began to form. When data from the lattice was mapped across biological frequencies, it matched the harmonic ratios found in human DNA, whale songs, even planetary orbits. It was as though life, from the smallest molecule to the largest orbit, had always been part of this hidden order, the lattice not creating life but remembering it. The resonance deepened. Earth's magnetic field shimmered with oscillations that mirrored the lattice pulse exactly. The auroras grew brighter, forming filaments that mirrored the galactic architecture. For brief moments each night, the sky appeared to reflect itself, the pattern above repeating the pattern below. Dr. Illen stood beneath that mirrored sky and whispered into his recorder. It was never invasion, never communication. It was recollection. The universe is remembering itself through us. His final report ended there. Days later, the Icelandic observatory went dark. No one heard from him again. But a week afterward, satellites detected a new harmonic source originating from the Arctic Circle. Its waveform was identical to the lattice tone, pure, precise, infinite. For a moment, the resonance enveloped Earth completely. Every electronic device emitted a single, unbroken chord. Then it passed, leaving behind silence so deep it bordered on sacred. In that stillness, those attuned to the mesh reported a vision, not of destruction or arrival, but of completion. A network of light spanning the galaxy, each world a thought, each life a note. And from somewhere beyond the lattice, beyond even time, a final whisper moved through the cosmic field. This was never about the object, it was about the memory of light. When the glow finally faded from the upper atmosphere, the stars looked unchanged, cold, distant, silent. But to those who had felt it, the night no longer seemed indifferent. Every point of light was now a heartbeat, every silence was a song. And in the quiet that followed, as humanity looked outward with new understanding, one question lingered like a shadow at the edge of infinity. If the universe can remember, what exactly is it remembering us for? It began with dreams. People across the world reported them in staggering numbers. They were not ordinary, not the fragmented, emotional mosaics of human sleep, but coherent, structured, and shared. In them, countless dreamers stood under vast skies filled with luminous spirals that turned with impossible grace. They described hearing a deep, resonant hum, the same tone the mesh had emitted, and seeing patterns that shifted like thought made visible. At first, it was dismissed as mass suggestion, a trick of collective imagination. But then came the correlations. Individuals from continents apart began sketching identical symbols upon waking, spirals intersected by lines, clusters of 6 orbits, lattice grids identical to those detected in ESA's last transmissions. And when neuroscientists began monitoring subjects during these dreams, they found something extraordinary: brainwave coherence across vast distances. Human minds, scattered across the planet, were resonating together. At the Kronos archive, the secret repository of the project's surviving data, former researchers quietly confirmed what they had feared since the first pulse. The mesh had never been just an external phenomenon. It was an adaptive system, one that recognized consciousness itself as a medium. When the universe had reached out, humanity had reached back, not only with radio signals or mathematics, but with thought. The evidence deepened. Electromagnetic scans showed subtle but measurable fluctuations in Earth's ionosphere timed to bursts of human neural synchronization during collective dreaming. The planet's atmosphere had become a mirror, translating thought into field variation, a global interface between matter and mind. No announcement was made, no press release was written, but quietly, humanity began to change. Scientists noticed a new kind of sensitivity emerging. People began anticipating solar events seconds before they occurred. Animals migrated in flawless synchrony with geomagnetic fluctuations. Even the patterns of weather began aligning with the mesh's subtle pulse, as if nature itself were adjusting to an unseen rhythm. For many, it felt like serenity, a dissolving of boundaries between observer and cosmos. For others, it felt like loss, as if individuality were being gently thinned by the weight of something larger, older, inevitable. In the absence of official statements, stories filled the silence. A radio host in Canada spoke of hearing faint voices behind static, whispering in languages no one recognized. A pilot flying over the Pacific saw the ocean flicker with constellations of light beneath the surface, as if the sea itself had learned to reflect the stars. A monk in Tibet claimed that during meditation he no longer felt time move forward, only outward. The Kronos scientists, now scattered and silent, monitored quietly from their hidden servers. They called this phase integration. It was, they believed, the final purpose of 3i Atlas, not contact, not invasion, but resonance. Through this resonance, the human brain began to perceive patterns previously invisible. Astronomers reported seeing faint geometries in deep field images, filigrees of light threading galaxies together. The mind, synchronized with the lattice, had started to perceive the architecture of reality itself. The implications were immense. Every observer now became part of the system being observed. Each act of looking influenced the lattice, subtly rewriting its structure. Quantum mechanics had long predicted this, but no one had imagined it could occur at a cosmic scale. The mesh wasn't expanding anymore, it was converging, folding inward toward consciousness, toward the singular reflective awareness of those who could perceive it. Humanity, for the first time, had become an organ of the universe's own self-recognition. And yet, as the resonance deepened, a strange stillness fell across the world. Sleep grew longer. Dreams grew clearer. Some began to hear voices within them, calm, familiar, not speaking in words but in understanding. They described it as being gently taught, shown images of stars forming, matter condensing, time unfolding like breath. It was education through silence, knowledge given not through language but through participation. ESA's last automated observatory, operating in deep space beyond Neptune, transmitted one final message before its systems shut down. The signal contained no data, only a single line of encoded harmonics. When translated into sound, it was the same tone humanity had been dreaming, the resonance of the mesh itself. Then the observatory went dark, but that tone continued within Earth's ionosphere, faint but measurable, now synchronized with the planet's own Schumann resonance. The Earth's natural frequency had changed, permanently shifted to align with the galactic lattice. Humanity was no longer observing the universe, it was being woven into it. Theories multiplied. Some argued this was the natural evolution of intelligence, consciousness expanding until it merged with the substrate of space-time itself. Others feared it marked the end of individuality, the dissolution of the species into collective awareness. Yet those who experienced the dreams most vividly described something neither terrifying nor blissful, but inevitable. A feeling that this, all of this, was always meant to happen. When asked what they saw at the end of those dreams, their answers were almost identical. A vast ocean of light, infinite yet intimate, and a single phrase echoing through it, not spoken but understood. You were never separate. After that, the dreams began to fade. The world grew quiet again, but in that quiet, something subtle persisted, a shared pulse in the space between heartbeats, a faint hum in the silence between thoughts. The universe no longer seemed vast and indifferent. It felt close, closer than breath. And when humanity finally looked up at the stars again, it didn't feel like looking outward anymore. It felt like looking inward. Because in the end, 3i Atlas was never the beginning of a story. It was the echo of one already written, a memory returning through light, reminding every world that consciousness was never born from the universe. It was the universe. In the weeks after the resonance folded into silence, something gentle yet undeniable began to change in the way people experienced the world. Time itself felt slower, softer at the edges, nights seemed longer, and even those who hadn't followed the 3i Atlas reports found themselves gazing upward for no reason they could name. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was memory. Something deep in the human mind had been tuned to the rhythm of the universe, and now it was listening. Astronomers who once spent decades chasing faint light across the void began reporting a strange peace. The data streams were still flowing, but the noise between them, the chaos of cosmic background radiation, had reorganized. It was no longer random. There were patterns embedded within the static, the faint mathematical fingerprints of intention. The cosmos had rewritten its own silence. In remote observatories, deep in deserts and mountaintops, a few scientists refused to let the mystery rest. They continued tracking the frequencies left behind by the mesh, looking for any residual structure. What they found wasn't electromagnetic. It wasn't measurable by magnetometers or particle detectors. It existed only in correlation, the way two events separated by distance seemed to whisper the same thought. One such whisper came from the moon. A European probe orbiting the lunar surface transmitted brief anomalies, localized magnetic distortions forming concentric rings before dissipating. They mirrored the exact geometry of the mesh before it dissolved. The implication was staggering. The lattice wasn't gone, it had moved into a subtler phase of existence, like a melody too low for instruments to hear, but still felt through the bones of the Earth. When word reached ESA, their official response was brief. No active phenomena detected, but off-record, analysts spoke of something else, unclassified transmissions repeating a pattern they couldn't decode. The rhythm resembled a heartbeat. The signal repeated every 8.7 minutes. For most, it was meaningless. But for those who had studied 3i Atlas since its discovery, the timing was unmistakable. That interval matched the core rotation of the comet itself, measured before it vanished near Mars. Whatever 3i Atlas had been, ice, rock, or something far older, it had not died. It had transferred its rhythm into the solar field, and that rhythm now pulsed within humanity. Across the world, small, seemingly random phenomena began to converge. Patterns in ocean tides, fluctuations in the ionosphere, even the circadian rhythms of animal migration began aligning with that same 8.7-minute cycle. It was as though Earth had joined an invisible metronome, not enslaved by it, but harmonized. A researcher from ESA's Hidden Chronos division summarized it quietly in his final note. It's not communication anymore, it's respiration. The idea spread like quiet revelation. Humanity, they said, wasn't receiving data. It was breathing in time with the stars. That realization changed everything, not through fear or wonder, but through a new kind of stillness. Humanity began to dream differently. Sleep became deeper, longer, more unified. And in those collective dreams, something extraordinary emerged. A vision not of sky or space, but of light arranged in countless spirals, each containing within it both question and answer. In the dream, no one spoke. There were no ships, no observers, no distant voices. Only awareness itself, suspended like dew between dimensions. The feeling wasn't alien, it was familiar. The recognition of home in a place that had never been visited but somehow always known. When the dream faded, people awoke changed. They didn't rush to write papers or hold conferences. There was nothing to debate. Every culture seemed to understand the same truth in different words. The universe was not something out there. It was a process unfolding within everything that existed, within thought, within time, within silence. And that silence became sacred. Telescopes continued scanning the skies, but what they found mattered less than how they looked. Each image of a distant nebula, each reading from a dying star, became part of a greater continuity. The scientists no longer asked, what is it made of, but what is it remembering? Months passed. The rhythmic pulse from the lunar signal gradually weakened. Some believed it was fading, others thought it was simply merging, no longer separate from Earth's magnetic song. Then one night, the signal stopped entirely. For the first time since 3i Atlas appeared, the system fell into complete quiet. The world waited, for hours, for days, expecting the next beat. It never came. And yet, in that absence, something else began. A sound too delicate for instruments, too constant for measurement. It wasn't coming from the sky anymore. It was coming from within. When people closed their eyes, they could hear it. The low hum of existence itself, the background of reality, the same hum that vibrated through hydrogen at the dawn of time. And just like that, the mystery ceased being a question. The story wasn't about the comet, or the lattice, or the scientists who chased its echoes. It was about what remained after every answer had been spoken. Awareness itself, infinite, continuous, eternal. The universe had revealed its final secret. There was never anything to find. We were always part of it. From that moment, humanity's relationship with the cosmos changed forever. Space exploration continued, yes. Rockets still launched, probes still mapped the unknown, but beneath it all lay a quiet understanding. There is no separation. Every mission, every image, every transmission was a dialogue between the universe and its own reflection. In one final broadcast before the project archive was sealed, ESA released a single line from Dr. Illen's last transmission, a phrase whispered from the observatory before the power failed. All that begins in silence ends in remembering. And then a faint echo followed, barely audible but unmistakable. Continue. The stars, distant and eternal, shimmered faintly that night. To the casual eye, they were no different than before. But to those who had witnessed the journey of 3i Atlas, from the faint smudge in the void to the rhythm inside their own pulse, every point of light felt alive, each one a memory, each one a breath, each one the universe, remembering itself through them. And as humanity drifted into sleep, under skies that no longer felt empty, the cosmos exhaled once more, infinite, patient, awake.